Carl Jung explained, "If they demand these 5 things, they're not your friend. In the beginning, there was silence. Not the empty silence of void, but the pregnant silence of possibility, the same silence that exists in the sacred pause between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the moment when one soul recognizes another across the vast expanse of human longing. It is here, in this liminal space where all relationships are born, that we must begin our journey into the deeper mysteries of connection. You have felt it, haven't you? That moment when someone enters your life and something within you stirs, a recognition so profound it seems to bypass the mind entirely and speak directly to the ancient wisdom dwelling in your bones. This is the soul's first whisper, its attempt to guide you toward what Jung called the authentic encounter. Yet how often do we silence this inner voice with the noise of social expectation, with the desperate hunger to be accepted, to be chosen, to matter in someone else's story? The sacred grove, where souls meet soul, is not a place you can find on any map. It exists in that mysterious realm where the visible and invisible worlds intersect, where the persona we present to the world falls away like autumn leaves, revealing the naked truth of who we are beneath all our carefully constructed defenses. This is the space of genuine encounter, where 2 beings can stand before each other without masks, without pretense, without the exhausting performance of being someone other than themselves. But here lies the first great paradox of human relationship. We live in a world that has forgotten how to enter this sacred grove. We have become so skilled at wearing our personas, those social masks Jung described as necessary for navigating the collective world, that we have forgotten there is anyone authentic living beneath them. We mistake the mask for the face, the performance for the person, the social role for the soul. Like ancient alchemists bent over their crucibles, seeking to transform base metals into gold, we must learn the art of discernment in the laboratory of relationship. The alchemists understood that not all substances could be transmuted, that some materials would only corrupt the sacred process. So too must we learn to recognize the difference between those who come to us as fellow seekers of truth and those who arrive as hungry ghosts, drawn not by love, but by the scent of energy they can consume. The philosopher's stone, that mythical substance capable of transforming everything it touched, was never really about creating physical gold. It was a symbol of the individuated self, the whole human being who had integrated all the scattered fragments of their psyche into a unified whole. In relationship, we seek this same alchemical transformation. We long to find those rare souls who will not diminish us, but will catalyze our becoming, who will serve as mirrors, reflecting not just who we are, but who we have the potential to become. Yet how do we recognize the gold of genuine friendship when we live in a world full of fool's gold? The answer lies in understanding what Jung called the archetypal patterns that govern human relationship. These are not abstract concepts, but living energies that move through us, shape us, draw us toward certain people, and repel us from others. They are the invisible currents that determine whether a relationship will nourish our growth or drain our life force. The authentic friend arrives carrying the energy of what Jung called the helpful figure, the archetypal presence that appears in our dreams and myths as the wise teacher, the loyal companion, the one who stands with us in the dark hours, not because they need something from us, but because they recognize something sacred in our struggle. They come not to complete us, for that is the fantasy of the romantic projection, but to witness our completion of ourselves. In contrast, the shadow friend operates from an entirely different archetypal pattern. They embody what the ancients knew as the vampiric presence, not the literal blood drinker of folklore, but the energy vampire who feeds on attention, drama, emotional intensity, and the life force of others. They are drawn to us not by love, but by hunger, not by recognition, but by need. They sense in us what they lack in themselves and mistake their craving for connection. The tragedy is that most of us have been conditioned to mistake this hunger for love, this need for devotion. We have been taught that to be needed is to be loved, that to be indispensable is to be valued. We confuse the desperate clinging of emotional dependency with the steady warmth of genuine affection. We mistake the intensity of drama for the depth of intimacy. This confusion stems from what Jung called the unconscious, that vast realm of the psyche that contains everything we have forgotten, repressed, or never learned to understand about ourselves. In the unconscious dwell all our unlived lives, our unhealed wounds, our unmet needs from childhood. When we encounter someone who promises to fill these empty places within us, we experience what feels like recognition, but is actually projection. We are seeing in them not who they are, but who we need them to be. The persona we wear in daily life becomes both our protection and our prison. It shields us from the vulnerable rawness of authentic encounter, but it also prevents us from recognizing when someone is relating to our mask rather than our essence. The false friend is content to love your persona. Indeed, they prefer it, for the persona is predictable, controllable, useful. They have no interest in the messy complexity of your actual self, with its contradictions, its growing edges, its refusal to remain static. This is why Jung spoke of the necessity of what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into either extreme. In relationship, this means learning to maintain both vulnerability and boundaries, both openness and discernment, both love and wisdom. It means developing the ability to see clearly while keeping the heart open, to trust while remaining aware. The dance between authentic and shadow relationships is as old as humanity itself. In every culture's mythology, we find stories of the true friend and the false friend, the loyal companion and the betrayer, the one who lifts you up and the one who pulls you down. These are not mere stories, but maps of the human psyche, guides for navigating the treacherous terrain of relationship. Consider the myth of Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring into the pool. This is the shadow relationship in its purest form, the inability to see the other as other, the compulsion to relate only to what serves the ego's needs and desires. The narcissistic friend loves only their reflection in you, and when you stop reflecting what they want to see, their love vanishes like morning mist. Or consider the story of Psyche and Eros, where love requires the courage to see truly, even when seeing reveals imperfection. The authentic relationship is one where both souls are willing to be seen, not just in their beauty, but in their brokenness, not just in their strength, but in their struggle. It is love that can survive the lighting of the lamp, love that grows deeper through knowledge rather than dimmer through familiarity. In this opening chamber of wisdom, we must acknowledge a difficult truth. We cannot recognize the authentic friend until we have begun the work of befriending ourselves. We cannot see clearly in others what we have not learned to see in ourselves. We cannot offer genuine love until we have experienced it from within. The journey toward healthy relationship is, first and always, a journey toward wholeness within ourselves. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not the ego's fantasy of independence, but the soul's movement toward integration. It is the process by which we reclaim all the scattered pieces of ourselves, embrace both our light and our shadow, and learn to love the totality of who we are. Only from this place of inner wholeness can we truly recognize and receive the gift of authentic friendship. As we stand at the threshold of this exploration, we must prepare ourselves for what lies ahead. We will descend into the shadow realm of false friendship, Examine the subtle and not so subtle ways we are manipulated and drained by those who wear the mask of care while harboring the heart of consumption. We will learn to recognize the 5 great demands that mark the energy vampire, the soul feeder, the false friend. But this descent is not merely an exercise in detection or protection. It is a journey toward the light of authentic connection, toward relationships that honor the sacred nature of the human soul. For in learning to recognize what love is not, we prepare ourselves to recognize what love is. In understanding the patterns of spiritual vampirism, we develop the capacity to both offer and receive genuine nourishment. The sacred grove awaits, but first, we must learn to see in the darkness. In the twilight hours of the soul, when the ego has grown weary of its careful constructions and the persona begins to slip like an ill-fitting mask, we encounter the most treacherous territory of human connection, the shadow-laden realm where friendship becomes a mirror of our own unacknowledged darkness. Here, in this liminal space between authentic intimacy and unconscious projection, we must face a truth that cuts deeper than betrayal itself. We have become accomplices in our own deception. The false friend does not arrive as an obvious adversary, cloaked in malevolent intention. No, this figure emerges from the mists of our own psychological need, wearing the face of companionship while embodying the very aspects of ourselves we have banished to the unconscious depths. They are the trickster at the crossroads of our psyche, neither wholly evil nor entirely innocent, but rather a complex constellation of our own disowned shadow material, given flesh and breath through the mysterious alchemy of projection. Jung understood that we do not simply attract random cruelty into our lives. Instead, we unconsciously magnetize those who carry the energetic signature of our own repressed darkness. The parts of ourselves we deemed too dangerous, too shameful, too primitive to integrate into our carefully curated self-image. The false friend becomes the external container for all that we refuse to acknowledge within. The greedy child who demands without offering, the manipulative strategist who uses others as instruments of personal gain, the wounded narcissist who experiences empathy as weakness rather than strength. Watch how the dance begins. In the initial stages of such relationships, there exists a peculiar resonance, an almost magnetic pull that defies rational explanation. We find ourselves drawn to these individuals, not despite their shadow qualities, but because of them. Some unconscious part of our psyche recognizes in them the familiar vibration of our own unlived life, our own unexpressed darkness. They represent everything we have forbidden ourselves to be, and in their presence, we experience a vicarious thrill of shadow expression while maintaining the illusion of our own moral superiority. The false friend operates from what Jung would recognize as the realm of the pure eternus, the eternal child who refuses the responsibilities of genuine reciprocity. They arrive in our lives carrying an implicit demand: feed me, sustain me, provide for me the emotional, material, or psychological resources I require, but expect nothing in return save the privilege of my presence. This dynamic reflects our own inner child's unmet needs, projected outward onto a figure who seems to embody the fearless selfishness we never allowed ourselves to express. In the theater of false kinship, we unconsciously assume the role of the eternally giving parent, the inexhaustible fountain of resources and support. We tell ourselves we are being generous, compassionate, evolved, but beneath this noble narrative lurks a more complex truth. Through our excessive giving, we are attempting to heal our own wounds of abandonment and neglect. We hope that by being the perfect friend, the endlessly available support system, we can somehow retroactively receive the unconditional love we never experienced in our own formative relationships. But the shadow dynamics run deeper still. Our compulsive generosity toward these taker friends often masks our own unconscious aggression, our own hidden agenda of control and manipulation. By positioning ourselves as the indispensable giver, we create a power dynamic that serves our ego's need for importance and superiority. We become addicted to being needed, to occupying the moral high ground, to playing the role of the long-suffering saint who endures mistreatment with noble forbearance. The false friend, in their relentless taking, reflects back to us our own capacity for consumption and greed. Perhaps we do not demand material resources or constant emotional labor from others, but we may consume attention, validation, praise, or gratitude with equally voracious hunger. The friend who always needs money mirrors our own need for constant reassurance. The friend who monopolizes conversations reflects our own desire to be the center of every narrative. The friend who creates drama and crisis may be showing us our own addiction to intensity and emotional chaos. Through the lens of enantiodromia, Jung's principle that all things eventually transform into their opposite, we begin to understand how our most generous impulses can become vehicles for shadow expression. The helper becomes the manipulator, the giver becomes the controller, the self-sacrificing friend becomes the resentful victim. We start as angels of mercy and discover ourselves transformed into martyrs, bitter and depleted, wondering how our pure intentions led to such contaminated outcomes. The trickster archetype that governs false friendship thrives on ambiguity and paradox. Unlike the straightforward enemy who declares their opposition openly, the false friend operates in the gray zones of human motivation. They offer just enough authentic connection to keep us engaged, just enough genuine need to justify our continued investment, just enough intermittent reinforcement to maintain the addictive cycle of hope and disappointment. They are masters of the mixed message, the partial truth, the promise that remains forever almost fulfilled. This ambiguity serves a crucial psychological function. It prevents us from making clean breaks and clear decisions. In genuine relationships, boundaries can be established and maintained through honest communication. But with false friends, every boundary becomes negotiable. Every limit becomes subject to their particular brand of manipulation. They excel at finding the precise words that will reopen our hearts just as we begin to close them, that will resurrect our hope just as we begin to accept reality. The false friend knows intuitively how to activate our rescue fantasies, our grandiose delusions of being able to heal or transform another human being through the sheer force of our love and dedication. They present themselves as wounded birds who need just a little more time, just a little more support, just one more chance to prove their worthiness of our investment. And we, caught in the grip of our own savior complex, cannot resist the opportunity to play God in someone else's story. But Jung reminds us that every psychological dynamic serves the larger process of individuation, even the most painful and destructive ones. The false friend appears in our lives not as random misfortune, but as a necessary teacher in the curriculum of self-knowledge. Through the mirror of their shadow behavior, we are forced to confront aspects of ourselves that would otherwise remain comfortably unconscious. The friend who takes without giving shows us our own capacity for entitlement and exploitation. The friend who lies and manipulates reveals our own relationship with truth and deception. The friend who creates chaos and drama mirrors our own addiction to intensity over peace. The friend who refuses to take responsibility for their actions reflects our own tendency to blame others for our choices and circumstances. As we begin to recognize these shadow projections, we face the most challenging aspect of psychological growth, the withdrawal of projection and the integration of our own darkness. We must acknowledge that the false friend's behavior, while genuinely harmful and inappropriate, also serves as an external representation of our own internal conflicts. We must own our part in creating and maintaining these toxic dynamics without falling into the trap of self-blame or victim-shaming. This process requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into simplistic either-or thinking. We must simultaneously recognize the genuine harm caused by false friends while acknowledging our own unconscious complicity in these dynamics. We must develop compassion for their wounded humanity while refusing to enable their destructive behavior. We must learn to see their shadow projections onto us without taking them personally or allowing them to define our self-worth. The journey through false friendship becomes a crucible for developing what Jung termed the feeling function, our capacity for authentic emotional discrimination. We learn to distinguish between genuine intimacy and manipulative bonding, between healthy vulnerability and inappropriate emotional dumping, between natural reciprocity and calculated exchange. We develop the subtle art of reading energy and motivation beneath the surface of words and actions. In the end, the false friend serves as an unwitting guide into the depths of our own unconscious, forcing us to confront the shadow aspects of our relational patterns and compulsions. Through their darkness, we discover our own light. Through their taking, we learn the art of conscious giving. Through their manipulation, we develop authentic personal power. Through their abandonment, we find our way back to ourselves. The shadow of false kinship ultimately teaches us that true friendship cannot exist without the integration of our own darkness. Only when we have made peace with our own capacity for selfishness, manipulation, and harm can we create relationships based on authentic choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Only when we have withdrawn our projections and owned our shadow can we see others clearly enough to love them without losing ourselves. This is the paradoxical gift of the false friend. Through their betrayal, we discover loyalty to ourselves. Through their deception, we find our own truth. Through their taking, we learn the sacred art of conscious giving and conscious receiving. They become the unwitting agents of our individuation, the shadow teachers who force us to grow beyond our comfortable illusions into the challenging but ultimately liberating territory of psychological wholeness. In the vast landscape of human need, there exists a particular form of hunger that transcends ordinary desire. A ravenous, bottomless craving that can never be satisfied because it seeks to devour not just attention or comfort, but the very essence of another's emotional being. This is the first and most insidious demand of the false friend. The expectation of your complete emotional availability, a soul-deep requirement that you transform yourself into a living sanctuary for their unhealed wounds. Like ancient vampires, a folklore who are drawn not merely to blood, but to the life force itself, these wounded souls arrive at the threshold of your psyche in the darkest hours of their own despair. They come not seeking mutual exchange or genuine companionship, but rather the total absorption of your emotional resources, your empathy, your concern, your energy, your very capacity to feel. They require you to become their emotional mother, their perpetual healer, their inexhaustible well of compassion from which they can drink without ever offering sustenance in return. This demand emerges from what Jung recognized as the wounded child archetype, that aspect of the psyche that remains forever frozen in the early stages of development, desperately seeking the perfect maternal figure who will retroactively heal all the abandonments, rejections, and failures of care that shaped their fundamental relationship to the world. The false friend, trapped in this archetypal pattern, experiences every relationship through the lens of this primal need, unconsciously casting others in the role of the all-giving mother while they remain the eternally deserving child. But observe how this dynamic unfolds in the theater of false friendship. The wounded child archetype does not present itself honestly, declaring its needs with transparent vulnerability. Instead, it operates through a complex web of manipulation and emotional coercion, using guilt, crisis, and manufactured urgency to secure the emotional resources it craves. The false friend becomes a master of emotional terrorism, creating situations where your availability becomes a matter of their psychological survival, where your boundaries become acts of cruelty, where your own needs become selfish impositions on their suffering. They arrive at your door, literally or metaphorically, at precisely the moments when you are most depleted, most in need of rest and restoration. This is not coincidence, but unconscious design, for the wounded child has developed an uncanny ability to sense when others are vulnerable, when their defenses are down, when their capacity for saying no has been compromised by their own exhaustion or emotional overextension. They possess an almost supernatural radar for detecting the precise moment when you might be most susceptible to their demands. The phone rings at midnight, and their voice carries that particular quality of manufactured desperation that bypasses your rational mind and speaks directly to your rescue fantasies. They need you now, they say. They cannot survive the night without your presence, your reassurance, your willingness to drop everything and attend to their emotional emergency. And when you hesitate, when you express your own needs for sleep or solitude, or simply the right to exist outside their crisis, they respond with the wounded child's most powerful weapon, the accusation of abandonment. How skillfully they wield this blade, cutting directly to the heart of your own unhealed wounds around abandonment and rejection. They know, with the intuitive cunning of the desperate, exactly which words will reopen your own childhood scars, which accusations will trigger your own fear of being seen as selfish or uncaring. They transform your healthy boundaries into evidence of your moral inadequacy, your self-care into proof of your heartlessness, your inability to be available 24 hours a day into confirmation of your failure as a friend. This creates what Jung would recognize as a toxic fusion, a psychological state where two individuals become so enmeshed that neither can achieve the separation necessary for authentic individuation. The false friend's emotional life becomes completely dependent on your availability, while your sense of worth becomes tied to your ability to meet their endless needs. You lose yourself in the maze of their emotional demands, forgetting your own rhythms, your own needs, your own sacred right to exist as a separate and whole individual. The wounded child archetype, when activated in this destructive pattern, operates from a place of infinite entitlement. They believe, with the unshakable conviction of the truly desperate, that their pain gives them the right to consume others without limit. Their suffering becomes a form of currency that they spend freely, purchasing your attention, your concern, your emotional labor with the coin of their own misery. They have learned to weaponize vulnerability, to use their wounds as tools of manipulation rather than gateways to authentic healing. But Jung's profound insight reveals that this pattern serves a deeper purpose in the economy of the psyche. The false friend's demand for complete emotional availability mirrors our own relationship with the mother archetype, both the nourishing mother who provides unconditional love and the devouring mother who consumes her children's individuality in the name of care. Through these relationships, we are forced to confront our own mothering patterns, our own capacity for both nurturing and enabling, our own ability to love without losing ourselves. The false friend becomes a teacher in the most painful curriculum of all, the development of what Jung called the feeling function in its mature form. They force us to learn the difference between genuine compassion and codependent rescue, between healthy empathy and toxic emotional fusion. Through their endless demands, we are compelled to develop the capacity for what might be called conscious love. Love that maintains its own boundaries, that nurtures without enabling, that cares without losing itself in the other's need. This process requires us to face our own shadow around emotional availability, Perhaps we recognize in their demands our own capacity for emotional vampirism, our own history of using others as emotional dumping grounds, our own tendency to measure love by availability rather than quality. Perhaps we see in their wounded child our own inner child's unmet needs, our own desperate hunger for the perfect caretaker who will heal all our wounds through their inexhaustible presence. The demand for complete emotional availability also forces us to examine our own relationship with the martyr archetype, that aspect of the psyche that finds meaning and identity through suffering and self-sacrifice. The false friend's endless needs provide the perfect stage for our own martyrdom complex, allowing us to play the role of the long-suffering saint who endures mistreatment with noble forbearance. We begin to derive a perverse satisfaction from our own depletion, wearing our exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof of our superior capacity for love and compassion. But Jung reminds us that the martyr's seeming selflessness often masks a profound selfishness, the ego's need to be needed, to occupy the moral high ground, to maintain the illusion of being indispensable to another's survival. Through our willingness to be emotionally consumed, we avoid the more challenging work of developing authentic intimacy, relationships based on mutual respect and genuine reciprocity rather than the addictive dynamics of rescue and dependency. This wounded child's demand for complete availability also reveals the false friend's terror of genuine individuation. They require constant emotional connection, not because they love deeply, but because they fear disappearing entirely. Their sense of self is so fragile, so dependent on external validation and attention, that any moment of separation threatens them with existential annihilation. They cannot bear to be alone with themselves, cannot tolerate the silence that would force them to confront their own inner emptiness. This creates a tragic irony. In their desperate attempt to avoid the loneliness of individuation, they create relationships that prevent both themselves and others from achieving the psychological separation necessary for authentic wholeness. They become emotional parasites, feeding off others' energy while never developing their own capacity for self-sustenance. They remain forever children, forever dependent, forever incapable of the mature love that can only emerge from two whole individuals choosing to share their completeness rather than trying to complete each other. The journey through this first demand of false friendship becomes a crucible for developing what Jung called conscious relationship, the ability to love without losing oneself, to care without enabling, to maintain emotional availability without sacrificing one's own psychological integrity. We learn that true compassion sometimes requires the courage to say no, that authentic love sometimes demands the willingness to allow others to face their own darkness without rushing in to rescue them from their necessary confrontation with reality. Through the mirror of their endless need, we discover our own capacity for healthy selfishness, not the narcissistic self-absorption that ignores others' legitimate needs, but the mature self-care that recognizes our own emotional resources as sacred and finite. We learn to tend our own inner garden before attempting to cultivate others' growth, to fill our own well before drawing water for others' thirst. The false friend's demand for complete emotional availability ultimately becomes a teacher in the art of conscious boundaries, those invisible lines that separate self from other, that protect the sacred space of individuality while still allowing for authentic connection. Through their violations of these boundaries, we learn where they exist, why they matter, and how to maintain them with both firmness and compassion. In the end, the wounded child's cry for total availability reveals itself as both a demand and a gift, a demand that would destroy us if we acquiesced completely, but a gift that teaches us the true meaning of love. For love, Jung understood, is not the fusion of two incomplete beings into one codependent whole, but the choice of two individuated souls to share their completeness while maintaining their essential separateness. The false friend's impossible demand becomes the catalyst for our own journey toward this mature love, this conscious relationship with both ourselves and others that honors both connection and autonomy, both compassion and self-preservation. In the deeper chambers of the collective unconscious, where archetypal forces shape the patterns of human relationship, there emerges a second demand, even more insidious than the first, the tyrannical requirement for unconditional agreement, the insistence that you abandon your own perspective and become a living echo of their reality. This is the realm where the false friend reveals their true nature as a psychological despot, unable to tolerate the natural friction that occurs when two authentic minds encounter one another in honest discourse. Like Narcissus gazing into the still waters, seeing only his own reflection and falling hopelessly in love with this mirrored image. The false friend requires you to become their perfect mirror, never showing them anything but their own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions reflected back in pristine agreement. They cannot bear the sight of your independent thought, your differing opinion, your unique perspective shaped by your own journey through the labyrinth of experience. To them, your disagreement is not a gift of authentic relationship, but a betrayal, a crack in the perfect mirror that threatens to shatter their carefully constructed illusion of rightness. This second demand stems from what Jung would recognize as a profound developmental arrest, an ego structure so fragile, so underdeveloped, that it cannot withstand the natural tension inherent in genuine relationship. The healthy ego learns early that other minds exist, that other perspectives have validity, that the world is vast enough to contain multiple truths simultaneously. But the false friend's ego remains trapped in the primitive stage of psychological development, where self and other have not yet differentiated, where any deviation from their reality feels like an existential threat to their very survival. Watch how this demand unfolds in the theater of false friendship. Initially, it may appear as a simple preference for harmony, a desire to avoid conflict and maintain peace. They speak eloquently of unity, of understanding, of the importance of supporting one another's viewpoints. But beneath this noble veneer lurks something far more sinister: the gradual erosion of your right to independent thought, the systematic dismantling of your capacity for authentic self-expression. The process begins subtly, almost imperceptibly. When you express a viewpoint that differs from theirs, they respond not with curiosity or genuine engagement, but with a particular kind of wounded surprise, as if your independent thought constitutes a personal attack on their character. They have perfected the art of making disagreement feel like betrayal, of transforming intellectual difference into emotional abandonment. "I thought you understood me," they say, or "I can't believe you would say that to me," turning your natural expression of selfhood into evidence of your cruelty. Gradually, you begin to censor yourself, to anticipate their reactions and modify your responses accordingly. You learn to swallow your authentic thoughts and offer instead the sanitized version that will maintain their emotional equilibrium. You become a curator of truth, selecting only those aspects of your genuine self that will not disturb their need for perfect reflection. You transform yourself into what Jung might call a living persona, a mask that has forgotten the face beneath it. This demand for unconditional agreement reveals the false friend's relationship with what Jung termed the transcendent function, that crucial psychological capacity that allows us to hold paradox, to contain opposing viewpoints, to navigate the creative tension between thesis and antithesis until a new synthesis emerges. The false friend lacks this fundamental capacity for psychological complexity. They experience the world in stark black and white, with no tolerance for the grey areas where most of authentic life actually occurs. In their psychological universe, you are either completely for them or completely against them. There exists no middle ground where you might support them in some areas while disagreeing in others, where you might love them as a person while questioning their behavior, where you might honor their pain while refusing to enable their destructive patterns. They reduce the rich complexity of human relationship to a binary choice, total agreement or total betrayal. This creates what Jung would recognize as a form of psychological totalitarianism within the relationship. Like political tyrants who cannot tolerate dissent, the false friend establishes an emotional regime where only one perspective is permitted to exist. They become the sole arbiter of truth, the final authority on all matters of interpretation and judgment. Your role becomes that of the loyal subject, nodding in agreement, applauding their insights, never daring to introduce the chaos of independent thought into their carefully ordered reality. The mythological resonance of this pattern runs deep. Like the emperor in the famous fairy tale who insisted that everyone admire his non-existent clothes, the false friend requires your participation in maintaining their illusions. They need you to see their wisdom where only confusion exists, their righteousness where only self-interest operates, their victimhood where only their own choices have created their circumstances. You become complicit in a collective delusion, a shared fantasy that protects them from the harsh but necessary light of reality. But Jung's principle of enantiodromia reveals the hidden truth within this dynamic. Every psychological extreme eventually transforms into its opposite. The false harmony demanded by the false friend ultimately creates its own destruction. The resentment builds like pressure in a sealed vessel, growing stronger with each swallowed truth, each suppressed opinion, each moment of authentic self-betrayal. What begins as agreement transforms into a kind of internal warfare, where part of you rebels against the tyranny of their demands, while another part desperately tries to maintain the peace. This suppression of authentic disagreement creates what Jung called shadow accumulation, the build-up of all the unexpressed thoughts, feelings, and perspectives that have been banished from conscious relationship. These suppressed aspects don't simply disappear. They gather force in the unconscious, waiting for the moment when they will erupt with volcanic intensity. The false harmony becomes a brittle shell containing a molten core of repressed authenticity. The false friend's inability to tolerate disagreement also reveals their profound terror of what Jung termed the other, that which exists outside. Their control, beyond their understanding, separate from their reality. Genuine relationship requires the courage to encounter otherness, to allow another consciousness to exist in its full complexity and contradiction. But the false friend experiences otherness as a threat rather than a gift, as chaos rather than creativity, as abandonment rather than the natural expression of individual autonomy. Their demand for agreement often escalates over time, becoming more sophisticated and manipulative as they learn which techniques most effectively suppress your independent thought. They may use emotional manipulation, making you responsible for their feelings when you disagree. They may employ intellectual intimidation, dismissing your perspectives as naive or uninformed. They may resort to moral blackmail, suggesting that your disagreement reveals fundamental character flaws or demonstrates your lack of loyalty and love. Perhaps most insidiously, they may use your own psychology against you, learning your particular vulnerabilities and triggers, then activating them whenever you dare to express independent thought. If you fear being seen as selfish, they will frame your disagreement as selfishness. If you struggle with guilt, they will make you feel guilty for not supporting them. If you value harmony, they will accuse you of creating conflict through your refusal to agree. This pattern reveals the false friend's relationship with what Jung called the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of the psyche that represents our capacity for relationship with the other. In healthy individuals, the anima or animus develops through genuine encounters with otherness, learning to appreciate difference, to find beauty in complexity, to discover truth through dialogue rather than monologue. But the false friend's anima or animus remains undeveloped, trapped in primitive patterns of possession and control rather than mature appreciation and respect. The psychological cost of submitting to this demand for unconditional agreement extends far beyond the specific relationship with the false friend. As you learn to suppress your authentic thoughts and feelings in service of their comfort, you develop what might be called chronic self-betrayal syndrome, a habitual pattern of abandoning your own truth in favor of others' expectations. This pattern then spreads to other relationships, creating a life where your authentic self becomes increasingly buried beneath layers of accommodating personas. Jung understood that the capacity for healthy disagreement is essential for psychological development. Through the friction of encountering different perspectives, we sharpen our own thinking, refine our understanding, discover the limitations of our current viewpoints. The false friend's demand for agreement robs both of you of this essential developmental opportunity, creating a stagnant pool where no new growth can occur. The journey through this second demand becomes a crucible for developing what Jung called the courage to be oneself, the willingness to maintain your authentic perspective even when it creates discomfort or conflict. You learn that love does not require the sacrifice of truth, that genuine friendship can not only tolerate, but actually thrives on the creative tension of different viewpoints. You discover that your unique perspective is not a burden to be hidden, but a gift to be shared, even when, especially when, it challenges others to expand their own understanding. Through the mirror of their intolerance for disagreement, you begin to examine your own relationship with difference and otherness. Perhaps you recognize your own discomfort with being challenged, your own tendency to surround yourself with yes-men who never force you to question your assumptions. Perhaps you discover your own subtle ways of punishing those who dare to disagree with you, your own mechanisms for maintaining the illusion of being always right. The false friend's demand for unconditional agreement ultimately becomes a teacher in the art of authentic relationship, showing you through negative example what genuine intimacy actually requires. True friendship, you discover, is not built on the foundation of perfect agreement, but on the bedrock of mutual respect for each other's autonomy. It flourishes not in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of skilled navigation through difference toward deeper understanding. In the end, the tyrannical demand for agreement reveals itself as both a prison and a key. A prison that would trap you in perpetual self-betrayal, but also a key that unlocks your understanding of what real relationship requires. Through their intolerance for your authentic voice, you discover the sacred importance of speaking your truth. Through their fear of your independence, you learn to value your own capacity for original thought. Through their demand for your echo, you find your own unique song, waiting to be sung in the world with courage and authenticity. As we descend deeper into the alchemical crucible of false friendship, where the lead of illusion slowly transforms into the gold of self-knowledge, we encounter the third and perhaps most insidious demand, the requirement that you sacrifice all other relationships upon the altar of their consuming insecurity. Like the jealous gods of ancient mythology who could not bear to share their worshippers' devotion with other deities, the false friend reveals their true nature as a possessive deity who seeks to reign supreme over the entire kingdom of your social world. This demand emerges not suddenly, but through a gradual process of psychological erosion, like water slowly wearing away stone until whole cliffs collapse into the sea. Initially, It masquerades as a natural deepening of intimacy, a drawing closer that feels like the inevitable progression of meaningful friendship. "We understand each other so well," they say. "No one else really gets you the way I do." They speak of your connection as special, unique, sacred, and gradually this specialness becomes a cage that separates you from all other human contact. Jung would recognize this pattern as a manifestation of what he termed anima or animus possession, where the unconscious feminine or masculine principle becomes contaminated with shadow material, transforming the natural impulse toward relationship into something twisted and controlling. The false friend operates from the archetype of the possessive lover, but unlike romantic possession, this dynamic masquerades as friendship while wielding the same devastating psychological weapons of isolation and control. The process begins with subtle criticisms of your other relationships, observations that seem to come from a place of caring concern. They notice how tired you seem after spending time with certain friends, how stressed you become when dealing with family obligations, how drained you appear after social gatherings. "I just worry about you," they say, their voice heavy with manufactured concern. "These people don't appreciate you the way they should. They take advantage of your kindness." At first, these observations may even seem insightful, touching on real frustrations you've experienced in other relationships. Perhaps you do feel unappreciated by some friends, overwhelmed by family expectations, or exhausted by social obligations. The false friend's critique resonates because it contains just enough truth to bypass your natural skepticism. They become the voice that validates your complaints, the witness to your suffering, the ally who sees clearly what others have done to wrong you. But Jung understood that every psychological dynamic serves multiple functions simultaneously. While the false friend appears to offer sympathy and understanding, they are actually engaged in a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare, systematically undermining your connections to others in order to secure their own dominance over your emotional landscape. They are not healing your relationship wounds, but rather exploiting them, using your genuine hurts as leverage to separate you from your support network. The campaign intensifies as they begin to position themselves as the sole source of genuine understanding in your life. They create a binary worldview where all other relationships are flawed, superficial, or actively harmful to your well-being, while your relationship with them represents the only authentic connection you possess. "No one else really knows you" becomes their refrain. They all want something from you, but I'm the only one who loves you for who you really are. This creates what Jung would recognize as a form of psychological colonization, where the false friend establishes their territory within your psyche and begins systematically eliminating all competing influences. Like an invasive species that destroys the biodiversity of an ecosystem, they work to create a monoculture of relationship where only their voice matters, only their needs are valid, only their perspective has worth. The demand for exclusive relationship operates through what might be called comparative devaluation, the systematic reduction of all other connections to highlight their own supposed superiority. Your family becomes toxic, your old friends become negative influences, your colleagues become people who don't understand your true potential. Even your relationship with yourself begins to erode as they position themselves as the expert on your own inner experience, the interpreter of your own feelings and needs. Watch how they respond when you spend time with others. There is a particular quality of wounded disappointment that appears, a sense that you have betrayed some unspoken sacred covenant by daring to enjoy other company. They may not explicitly forbid these relationships, but they create an atmosphere where maintaining them becomes emotionally costly. Every social engagement requires explanation, justification, sometimes even apology. You begin to experience your other relationships as burdens rather than sources of joy and support. The false friend has learned to weaponize their own emotional fragility, making their well-being dependent on your exclusive attention. When you spend time with others, they become mysteriously ill, unexpectedly vulnerable, suddenly in crisis. They develop an uncanny ability to create emergencies that coincide perfectly with your planned activities with other people. Your sister's birthday. Dinner becomes the night they have a panic attack. Your old friend's visit from out of town becomes the weekend they need you to help them through a devastating personal revelation. This pattern reveals the false friend's relationship with what Jung called the shadow of the poor eternus, the eternal child who never learned to share, who experiences any division of attention as abandonment, who cannot tolerate the reality that love multiplies rather than diminishes when shared with others. They remain trapped in the primitive psychological stage where relationships are viewed as zero-sum games, where another's gain necessarily represents their loss. The demand for relational sacrifice also exposes their profound misunderstanding of the nature of authentic intimacy. They confuse intensity with depth, possession with love, dependence with connection. True intimacy does not require the elimination of all other relationships, but rather finds its strength and sustainability through being part of a rich ecosystem of human connection. Healthy relationships support and encourage other relationships, recognizing that each connection feeds different aspects of the soul's needs. But the false friend operates from what Jung would identify as a place of profound inner poverty, a psychological wasteland where their own capacity for generating meaning, purpose, and satisfaction has withered. Unable to create a rich inner life or to develop genuine connections with multiple people, they seek to compensate for their internal emptiness by consuming yours. They become emotional cannibals, feeding off the richness of your social connections while simultaneously working to destroy them. The isolation they create serves multiple shadow functions. Practically, it eliminates potential sources of external perspective that might help you recognize the toxicity of the relationship. When you have no other close connections, you lose access to the reality testing that comes from multiple viewpoints. Your other friends might notice patterns of manipulation or control that you cannot see from within the relationship, but if those friends have been systematically eliminated, their protective wisdom becomes unavailable to you. Psychologically, the isolation creates a form of Stockholm syndrome, where you become entirely dependent on your captor for emotional sustenance. Cut off from other sources of validation, support, and perspective, you begin to orient your entire emotional world around the false friend's needs and responses. They become both the cause of your pain and the only available source of relief. Both the prosecutor and the defense attorney in the courtroom of your psyche, Jung understood that this pattern often activates what he called the rescue fantasy, the unconscious belief that you can heal another person through the sacrifice of yourself. The false friend's obvious pain and isolation can trigger your own wounded healer archetype, convincing you that your exclusive devotion is somehow therapeutic for them. You tell yourself that they need you more than others do, that your loyalty might somehow fill the void within them, that your sacrifice is an act of compassion rather than enabling. But the rescue fantasy is itself a shadow manifestation, often hiding its own hunger for power and control. By positioning yourself as the indispensable healer, you avoid confronting your own need to be needed, your own addiction to feeling superior and essential. The false friend's demand for exclusive relationship can activate your own grandiose fantasies about your unique healing power, your special capacity to save those whom others have abandoned or misunderstood. The process of recognizing and extracting Yourself from this third demand requires what Jung called the development of the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity rather than falling into either-or thinking. You must learn to love the false friend's wounded inner child while refusing to enable their destructive patterns. You must develop compassion for their pain while maintaining loyalty to your own well-being and other relationships. This often requires a form of symbolic death and rebirth, the death of your identity as their exclusive savior, and the birth of your authentic self, who can love without losing yourself, who can care without being consumed. You must be willing to disappoint them, to allow them to experience the consequences of their choices, to step back from the role of their primary emotional resource, and allow them to develop their own capacity for self-soothing and multiple relationships. The journey through this third demand becomes a masterclass in what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self rather than what others need you to be. You learn that true love does not require the sacrifice of all other loves, that genuine friendship encourages rather than restricts your other connections, that healthy relationships create expansion rather than contraction in your social world. Through the mirror of their possessiveness, you also examine your own relationship with exclusivity and jealousy. Perhaps you recognize your own subtle ways of competing for friends' attention, your own discomfort when close friends develop other meaningful relationships, your own tendency to create hierarchies of importance that mirror the false friends' demand for supremacy. The false friend's requirement for relational sacrifice ultimately becomes a teacher in the art of what might be called conscious community, the ability to participate in multiple relationships simultaneously while maintaining authenticity and integrity in each one. You learn that your capacity for love is not a finite resource that must be hoarded and protected, but rather an infinite wellspring that grows stronger through generous sharing. In the end, the demand for exclusive relationship reveals itself as both a prison and a liberation, a prison that would isolate you from the rich community of human connection that feeds the soul, but also a liberation that teaches you the sacred importance of maintaining your social autonomy. Through their possessiveness, you discover your own need for diverse relationships. Through their jealousy, you learn to value your capacity for multiple loves. Through their demand for your complete social world, you find your way back to the community of souls who support your authentic growth and celebrate your individual journey toward wholeness. In the sacred chrysalis of transformation, where the old self must dissolve completely before the new can emerge, we encounter the fourth, and perhaps most soul-crushing demand of false friendship, the insidious requirement that you remain forever small, stagnant, unchanged. Like the crabs in the fisherman's barrel who instinctively pull down any among them who attempt to climb toward freedom, these false friends cannot tolerate the natural process of your individuation, the sacred journey toward becoming who you were always meant to be. This demand operates from the deepest shadows of human psychology, where envy masquerades as care, where sabotage disguises itself as protection, where the stunted soul seeks to create a world of perpetual stunting rather than face the painful reality of its own chosen stagnation. The false friend becomes the guardian of your limitations, the keeper of your small self, the voice that whispers, "Stay where you are," just as your wings begin to unfold. Jung understood that authentic growth threatens those who have made peace with their own psychological imprisonment. When you begin to expand beyond the boundaries of who you once were, when you start to question old patterns and embrace new possibilities, when you dare to step into the fullness of your potential, you inadvertently become a mirror that reflects back to others the choices they have made to remain small, Your light casts shadows on their darkness. Your movement highlights their inertia. Your courage exposes their fear. The false friend's terror of your growth reveals itself through a constellation of subtle but devastating behaviors. They become archaeologists of your past failures, constantly excavating old mistakes and disappointments to remind you of your limitations. Remember when you tried that before and it didn't work out, they say. Their voice is heavy with manufactured concern. I just don't want to see you get hurt again. They transform your history of learning and resilience into evidence of your inability to change, your past struggles into proof of your permanent limitations. Watch how they respond when you speak of dreams, aspirations, or new directions in your life. There is a particular quality of deflation that emanates from them, a subtle but unmistakable energy that seeks to puncture the balloon of your enthusiasm before it can fully inflate. They become experts at asking the exact questions designed to activate your deepest fears and insecurities. Are you sure you're qualified for that? Don't you think that's a bit ambitious? What if it doesn't work out? They present these challenges not as the natural friction that sharpens our resolve, but as evidence that we should abandon our aspirations entirely. This pattern reveals what Jung would recognize as the shadow of the Senex archetype, the wise, elder corrupted into the cynical critic who uses experience as a weapon against possibility. The false friend positions themselves as the voice of realism, the mature perspective that can save you from the folly of growth and change. But their realism is actually a form of psychological violence, a systematic assassination of hope and possibility disguised as wisdom and protection. The suppression of your growth serves multiple shadow functions for the false friend. Practically, it maintains the power dynamic that has developed between you. If you remain small and dependent, you continue to need their guidance, their support, their superior perspective on life. Your growth threatens their position as the more experienced, more capable, more together person in the relationship. They have built their identity around being your helper, your guide, your emotional superior, and your transformation would destabilize this entire psychological structure. More profoundly, your growth forces them to confront what Jung called their own unlived life. All the possibilities they abandoned, all the dreams they surrendered, all the potential they allowed to wither through fear, laziness, or simply the gradual accommodation to limitation. Your courage to change becomes an indictment of their choice to remain the same. Your willingness to risk failure in pursuit of growth highlights their preference for the safety of known limitations over the uncertainty of unexplored potential. The false friend operates from what might be called learned helplessness syndrome, where they have convinced themselves that change is impossible, growth is dangerous, and the status quo, however painful, is preferable to the uncertainty of transformation. They have made peace with their psychological prison and cannot bear to watch you find the key to yours. Your freedom becomes a reproach to their captivity, your expansion, a criticism of their contraction. This dynamic often activates what Jung termed the negative mother complex, or negative father complex, those aspects of the parental archetypes that seek to control and diminish rather than nurture and empower. The false friend becomes the overprotective parent who keeps their child small, not out of love, but out of their own need to feel important and needed. They speak the language of care while practicing the psychology of sabotage. The suppression of growth manifests through what might be called micro-invalidations, small, seemingly insignificant comments and behaviors that gradually erode your confidence in your own capacity for change. They forget to ask about important developments in your life, showing subtle but consistent disinterest in your progress. They change the subject when you share successes or breakthroughs, demonstrating that your growth is not worthy of celebration or even acknowledgement. They respond to your enthusiasm with distraction or deflection, teaching you that your excitement about your own life is unwelcome in their presence. Perhaps most insidiously, they begin to rewrite the narrative of your relationship in ways that cast your growth as betrayal. "You've changed," they say, with the particular tone that makes change sound like moral failure. "You're not the same person I used to know." They transform your natural evolution into evidence of your abandonment of them, your individuation into proof of your selfishness, your development into a personal attack on their static existence. Jung would recognize this as a manifestation of what he called psychological inertia, the tendency of psychic systems to resist, change and maintain existing patterns. The false friend has become an agent of inertia in your life, a gravitational force that pulls you back toward old patterns, old limitations, old ways of being that no longer serve your highest development. They become the voice of your own resistance to growth, externalized and made seemingly objective. The fourth demand also reveals the false friend's relationship with what Jung termed the transcendent function, that crucial psychological capacity that allows us to navigate between opposing forces and find creative solutions to life's paradoxes. Healthy relationships support the transcendent function, encouraging us to hold the tension between who we are and who we might become until a new synthesis emerges. But false friends seek to collapse this tension, to eliminate the creative discomfort of growth by convincing us to remain locked in familiar patterns. They cannot tolerate the natural cycles of death and rebirth that characterize authentic psychological development. When you begin to outgrow old aspects of yourself, when you start to shed limiting beliefs and behaviors like a snake shedding its skin, they experience your transformation as abandonment rather than evolution. They prefer the predictable pain of stagnation to the uncertain joy of expansion. The suppression of growth often intensifies when you begin to develop what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to embrace the discomfort that comes with genuine change rather than numbing it through distraction or denial. The false friend becomes an agent of unconscious suffering, encouraging you to remain trapped in patterns that cause pain but require no growth. They promote the familiar misery over the unfamiliar possibility of joy. This pattern reflects their own relationship with what Jung termed the call to individuation, that mysterious inner summons to become fully yourself that every soul receives. At various points in life, the false friend has refused their own call, choosing safety over growth, familiarity over authenticity, the known prison over the unknown freedom. Your willingness to answer your call reminds them of their own refusal, creating a psychological dissonance they can only resolve by convincing you to join them in their chosen stagnation. The journey through this fourth demand becomes a crucible for developing what Jung called faith in the process, the trust that growth, even when it leads through difficult territory, ultimately serves the soul's deepest needs. You must learn to distinguish between the voice of genuine caution and the voice of fear-based limitation, between realistic assessment of challenges and systematic sabotage of possibility. This requires developing what might be called growth. Loyalty to your own development that supersedes loyalty to others' comfort with your limitations. You must be willing to disappoint those who prefer you small, to outgrow relationships that cannot accommodate your expansion, to choose your authentic development over the false peace of stunted potential. Through the mirror of their growth phobia, you begin to examine your own relationship with change and expansion. Perhaps you recognize your own discomfort with others' success, your own subtle ways of diminishing those who dare to grow beyond their previous limitations. Perhaps you discover your own investment in others remaining static so that you can feel superior or needed or important. The false friend's demand for your perpetual smallness ultimately becomes a teacher in what Jung called the ethics of individuation, the recognition that we have a moral obligation to become fully ourselves, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of the collective. Every person who refuses to grow, who chooses comfort over development, who settles for less than their potential, impoverishes the entire human community. Your growth, when it is authentic and conscious, does not diminish others, but rather inspires them. It shows them what is possible, what courage looks like, what the human spirit can achieve when it commits to its own development. The false friend's fear of your growth reveals their misunderstanding of the nature of human potential. It is not a finite resource that must be hoarded, but an infinite wellspring that grows stronger through generous expression. In the end, the demand for suppressed growth reveals itself as both a test and a gift, a test of your commitment to your own development and a gift that teaches you the preciousness of your own unlimited potential. Through their fear of your light, you learn to value your own luminosity. Through their investment in your limitations, you discover your own boundless possibilities. Through their demand that you remain small, you find the courage to grow into the fullness of who you were always meant to be, regardless of who applauds or objects to your magnificent becoming. In the deepest chambers of the human heart, where mercy and manipulation intertwine like serpents in an ancient dance, there exists a shadow so profound that it masquerades as the very light it seeks to extinguish. This is the realm of the fifth demand, the expectation of endless forgiveness, without the sacred reciprocity of transformation. Here, in these twilight territories of the soul, we encounter the most insidious form of psychological vampirism, the one who feeds not on your energy, but on your very capacity for grace. Listen closely, for this is where the false friend reveals their most cunning nature. They have learned to weaponize your highest virtues, to turn your compassion into a blade that cuts only one direction, toward their benefit, never their growth. They come to you with tears that have lost their meaning, with apologies that echo, hollow in the chambers of repetition, with promises that dissolve like morning mist under the harsh light of unchanged behavior. Jung understood this phenomenon deeply when he spoke of the provisional life, that state of eternal becoming without ever being, of perpetual potential that never actualizes into authentic transformation. The false friend exists in this liminal space, forever on the threshold of change, forever promising tomorrow what they cannot deliver today. They have made an art of living in the space between transgression and redemption, never quite crossing into either territory completely. Watch how they approach you after each betrayal, each breaking of trust, each moment when their mask slips and reveals the calculating nature beneath. They do not come with the true contrition of the soul that has glimpsed its own darkness and recoiled in genuine horror. No, they come with the practiced sorrow of one who has learned that your forgiveness is a renewable resource, that your mercy can be harvested again and again without depleting their supply. "I'm sorry," they say, and the words carry the weight of ritual rather than recognition. "I know I've hurt you before, but this time is different. I'm changing, I'm growing. I see it now." These phrases become their liturgy, their sacred incantations, designed to unlock the gates of your grace once more. They have studied your responses, mapped your emotional terrain, and they know exactly which keys unlock which doors in the architecture of your compassion. But observe more closely. What accompanies these apologies? Where is the fundamental shift in behavior, the structural change in their patterns, the genuine accountability that transforms words into lived reality? Like actors who have memorized their lines but never inhabited their characters, they perform the dance of repentance without ever truly entering its sacred space. This is the cruelest form of psychological manipulation because it corrupts the very mechanism by which souls heal and relationships transform. Forgiveness, in its pure form, is one of the most powerful forces in the human experience. It is the bridge between what was and what could be, the alchemical process by which lead becomes gold, by which wounds become wisdom. But in the hands of the false friend, forgiveness becomes a trap, a revolving door that keeps you perpetually returning to the same painful patterns while believing you are walking the path of spiritual growth. They have learned to exploit your understanding of grace, your belief in redemption, your commitment to seeing the best in others. They know that your spiritual maturity makes you want to believe in second chances, in the possibility of transformation, in the healing power of love and patience. And so they present themselves as the wounded soul in need of your ministrations, the broken spirit that requires your continuous care and understanding. The false friend becomes an expert in the language of transformation without ever submitting to its demands. They speak of their childhood wounds, their traumatic experiences, their psychological struggles, not as explanations that lead to accountability, but as excuses that justify continued harmful behavior. They have learned to use their pain as a shield, deflecting responsibility while generating sympathy. "You don't understand what I've been through," they say, and in these words they seek to make their suffering a permanent license for causing suffering to others. This is where we must learn to distinguish between the mercy that heals and the enabling that destroys. True forgiveness, Jung would remind us, is not the absence of boundaries, but the presence of wisdom. It does not mean tolerating endless repetition of harmful patterns while telling ourselves we are being spiritual. It means understanding that genuine transformation requires both grace and accountability, both compassion and consequences. The false friend has learned to exploit your confusion between these two forms of mercy. They present themselves as the misunderstood soul who simply needs more love, more patience, more understanding. They make you feel that setting boundaries is unforgiving, that expecting change is judgmental, that protecting yourself is unspiritual. They have mastered the art of making their lack of growth your spiritual failing. But consider the deeper psychology at work here. The false friend's demand for endless forgiveness without change reveals something profound about their relationship. With their own shadow, they have not done the difficult work of facing their darkness, of integrating their disowned aspects, of taking responsibility for their impact on others. Instead, they have found a way to externalize the burden of their unconscious material. They make you the repository of their unprocessed pain, the container for their unintegrated shadow. In Jungian terms, they are living what he called enantiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite. Their apparent seeking of forgiveness has become its opposite, a way of avoiding the genuine transformation that true forgiveness requires. They have learned to use your grace as a drug, a way of numbing themselves to the pain of authentic self-examination. This creates a psychological dynamic that Jung would recognize as a form of unconscious projection. The false friend projects onto you the role of the all-forgiving parent, the infinite source of unconditional love that asks nothing in return. They want you to love them without requiring them to become lovable in their actions, to forgive them without requiring them to become worthy of forgiveness through genuine change. But here is where the deeper spiritual teaching emerges. The false friend's demand for endless forgiveness is actually a demand for you to enable their spiritual stagnation. They want you to become complicit in their refusal to grow, to join them in the illusion that love means never having to face the consequences of one's actions. They want you to mistake enabling for compassion, codependence for love, spiritual bypassing for genuine grace. The pattern becomes clear when you observe it over time. Each transgression is followed by the same cycle: the apparent remorse, the promises of change, the appeal to your higher nature, the expectation of renewed trust. but the fundamental structure of their behavior remains unchanged. They may modify the surface expressions, learn to be more subtle in their manipulations, but the core dynamic persists. They take without giving, they wound without healing, they consume without nourishing. This is the shadow of the helping relationship, the dark side of the caregiver archetype. The false friend has learned to position themselves as the perpetual patient, the one who always needs but never provides, the one who is always struggling but never progressing. They have found a way to make their stagnation your spiritual test, their lack of growth your opportunity for sainthood. But true spiritual maturity recognizes this pattern for what it is, a form of psychological vampirism disguised as spiritual seeking. The false friend feeds on your energy, your attention, your emotional resources, without ever offering genuine reciprocity. They consume your capacity for love without ever contributing to its renewal. They drain your spiritual resources while presenting themselves as the vehicle for your spiritual growth. Jung understood that the individuation process, the journey toward wholeness, requires both the integration of our shadow and the development of healthy boundaries. The false friend's demand for endless forgiveness without change is actually an invitation to abandon both of these essential tasks. They want you to ignore their shadow behavior while dissolving your own healthy boundaries. They want you to become an enabler, disguised as a saint. The deepest teaching here is that genuine love sometimes requires saying no to the beloved's destructive patterns. True compassion sometimes means allowing others to experience the consequences of their actions rather than shielding them from these essential lessons. The mercy that heals is not the mercy that enables. It is the mercy that serves truth, that honors both the wounded and the wounder by insisting on the possibility of genuine transformation. The false friend's resistance to this deeper form of love reveals the extent of their spiritual immaturity. They want the benefits of relationship without its responsibilities, the comfort of connection without the challenge of growth, the security of being accepted without the difficulty of becoming acceptable. They have confused love with indulgence, forgiveness with permission, grace with the absence of accountability. This is where we must learn to recognize the difference between the soul that is genuinely seeking transformation and the ego that is merely seeking comfort. The genuine seeker of forgiveness comes not just with apologies, but with evidence of inner work, not just with promises, but with changed behavior, not just with explanations, but with accountability. They understand that forgiveness is not a right to be demanded, but a gift to be earned through genuine transformation. The false friend, by contrast, approaches forgiveness as an entitlement. They believe that their pain justifies their harmful behavior, that their struggles excuse their impact on others, that their need for love overrides their responsibility to be loving. They have learned to use your spiritual principles against you, to make your commitment to growth a weapon in their arsenal of manipulation. But here, in this recognition, lies the beginning of your liberation. When you see clearly how your highest virtues have been weaponized against you, when you understand how your capacity for grace has been exploited, you begin to reclaim your power from the false friend's shadow. You begin to distinguish between the love that enables and the love that empowers, between the mercy that heals and the mercy that harms. The path forward requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining your capacity for forgiveness while developing your capacity for discernment, keeping your heart open while strengthening your boundaries, remaining compassionate while insisting on accountability. This is not easy work, for it requires you to navigate between the extremes of hard-heartedness and enabling, between judgment and discernment, between rejection and healthy limits. The false friend will resist this evolution in your relationship. They will interpret your new boundaries as betrayal, your insistence on accountability as lack of love, your refusal to enable as spiritual failure. They will tell you that you have become hard, that you have lost your compassion, that you are no longer the loving person you once were. This is their final manipulation, attempting to make you doubt your own growth, to question your own spiritual development, to return to the old patterns that serve their needs but not your wholeness. But remember this, the soul that truly seeks forgiveness welcomes accountability as a gift, embraces boundaries as a form of love, and celebrates your growth even when it challenges their comfort. The false friend's resistance to your evolution reveals the depth of their attachment to your enabling, their investment in your spiritual stagnation, their need for you to remain in the role of the infinite giver who asks nothing in return. This is the ultimate teaching of the fifth demand, that genuine forgiveness is not the absence of consequences, but the presence of possibilities, not the erasure of accountability, but the creation of space for authentic transformation. The false friend's demand for endless forgiveness without change is actually a demand for you to abandon your own spiritual journey, to sacrifice your growth on the altar of their comfort, to mistake their stagnation for your opportunity for sainthood. The liberation comes when you recognize that saying no to enabling is saying yes to genuine love, that refusing to participate in their destructive patterns is actually serving their highest good, that holding them accountable is a form of spiritual service. This is the paradox of conscious relationship. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to love someone in the way they demand. In the end, the false friend's demand for endless forgiveness without change is revealed as the ultimate test of your spiritual maturity. Will you mistake enabling for love? Will you confuse your capacity for grace with your responsibility to enable? Will you sacrifice your own growth on the altar of their comfort? Or will you choose the more difficult path of conscious love, the love that serves truth, that honors both yourself and others by insisting on the possibility of genuine transformation? The choice, as always, is yours. But know this, the soul that chooses conscious love, the heart that learns to distinguish between mercy and enabling, the spirit that insists on accountability as a form of grace. This is the consciousness that serves not only its own evolution, but the evolution of all it touches. This is the way of the true friend, the authentic lover, the conscious being who refuses to participate in the dance of mutual destruction disguised as spiritual seeking. For, in the end, the greatest gift you can give to anyone, including yourself, is the refusal to enable their spiritual stagnation. The highest form of love is the love that insists on growth, that serves truth, that honors the divine potential in both the giver and the receiver. This is the love that heals, the mercy that transforms, the forgiveness that liberates rather than binds. And so, in recognizing the false friend's demand for endless forgiveness without change, you take the first step toward reclaiming your power, your wisdom, and your capacity for genuine love. You begin to see that the most spiritual thing you can do is refuse to be unspiritual, that the most loving thing you can do is refuse to love in ways that harm, that the most forgiving thing you can do is refuse to forgive in ways that enable. This is the profound teaching hidden within the shadow of the fifth demand, that consciousness itself is the ultimate form of compassion, that awareness is the deepest form of love, that the courage to see clearly is the most sacred gift you can offer to a world lost in the illusion of unconscious enabling disguised as spiritual virtue. There exists, within the depths of human consciousness, an ancient wound that becomes paradoxically both our greatest suffering and our most profound gift. It is the wound that transforms us into healers, yet keeps us forever searching for wholeness in the fractured mirrors of other souls. This is the sacred dilemma of the wounded healer, the archetype that lives within those who have touched the darkness and emerged not unscathed but illuminated by their scars. In the mythic realm where psychological truth takes the form of eternal stories, we encounter Chiron, the centaur who was accidentally wounded by one of Heracles' poisoned arrows. Unlike other immortals, Chiron could not heal his own wound, yet this very limitation became the source of his extraordinary ability to heal others. He became the teacher of heroes, the guide who could navigate suffering because he had made it his eternal companion. This ancient tale speaks to something profound within the human psyche, the recognition that our deepest wounds often become the doorways through which we access our greatest capacity for compassion and understanding. The wounded healer archetype emerges from the primordial waters of our unconscious when life has cracked us open in ways that forever alter our perception of existence. Perhaps it was abandonment in childhood that left us perpetually seeking the love we never received. Perhaps it was betrayal that taught us the language of broken trust. Perhaps it was loss that showed us the geography of grief. Whatever the original wound, it becomes the lens through which we view the world, the magnet that draws us toward others who carry similar fractures in their souls. Yet here lies the great paradox that Jung understood so deeply. We are simultaneously drawn to heal and to be healed, to save and to be saved. The wounded healer does not simply seek out those who need healing. They unconsciously gravitate toward those whose wounds echo their own unresolved pain. In the theater of relationship, we find ourselves playing out ancient dramas, casting others in roles that mirror our own internal struggles, hoping against hope that by healing them, we might finally heal ourselves. This is not conscious deception, but rather the mysterious workings of what Jung called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that reveal the invisible threads connecting our inner and outer worlds. The wounded healer attracts broken souls not by accident, but because the psyche is always seeking completion, always moving toward wholeness through the most circuitous and often painful routes. We think we are choosing partners, friends, or even clients based on external factors, but the unconscious is orchestrating encounters that serve its deeper purpose of integration. The shadow side of this archetype reveals itself when we mistake our compulsion to heal others for genuine love or authentic connection. How many relationships have we entered believing we were responding to love, only to discover we were responding to the familiar ache of recognizing our own wound reflected in another? How many times have we confused the intensity of trying to save someone with the depth of truly knowing them? The wounded healer often finds themselves in a repetitive cycle, drawn again and again to partners who seem to need rescuing, only to discover that the very act of rescuing perpetuates a dynamic that prevents true healing for either party. Jung understood that what we resist in ourselves, we are compelled to encounter in the world. The wounded healer who has not yet learned to tend their own inner landscape will unconsciously seek out external situations that mirror their internal state. They become addicted to crisis, to drama, to the familiar territory of broken relationships and impossible situations, not because they are masochistic, but because the psyche recognizes these patterns as opportunities for growth, even when the conscious mind experiences them as suffering. The projection that occurs in these dynamics is profound and often invisible to the one experiencing it. The wounded healer sees in their chosen patient their own unlived potential, their own capacity for healing, their own possibility of wholeness. They project onto the other what they most need to reclaim within themselves: strength, vulnerability, innocence, or power. In trying to heal the other, they are unconsciously attempting to heal their own inner child, their own abandoned aspects, their own rejected parts. But projection is a two-way mirror. Just as the wounded healer projects their own healing potential onto others, they also project their own woundedness. They may see in their partner or friend a brokenness that is actually a reflection of their own unacknowledged pain. They may be drawn to chaos because their own inner world remains chaotic. They may be attracted to emotional unavailability because they themselves have never learned to be truly present with their own feelings. The synchronicity that Jung spoke of operates on multiple levels in these encounters. On the surface, it appears that the wounded healer is simply unlucky in love, always choosing the wrong people, always finding themselves in impossible situations. But at a deeper level, the psyche is orchestrating these meetings as opportunities for consciousness to expand, for shadows to be illuminated, for wholeness to be achieved through the very struggles that seem to be destroying us. The path toward conscious healing begins with the radical recognition that we cannot heal another person. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for the wounded healer to accept, for their entire identity has often been built around their capacity to fix, to save, to transform others through the power of their love and understanding. To accept that healing must come from within the other person is to face the terrifying possibility that their own healing must also come from within themselves. This recognition brings us face to face with our own helplessness, our own need, our own unhealed wounds. It strips away the persona of the helper, the savior, the one who has it all figured out, revealing the vulnerable human being who has been hiding behind the role of healer. This moment of truth is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it shatters our illusions of control, liberating because it frees us from the impossible burden of being responsible for another's wholeness. The individuation process for the wounded healer requires learning to differentiate between empathy and identification, between compassion and codependence, between genuine service and unconscious reenactment. True empathy allows us to feel with another without losing ourselves in their experience. Identification, on the other hand, collapses the boundary between self and other, creating a merged field where neither person can access their own authentic truth. Conscious healing emerges when we learn to hold space for another's pain without trying to fix it, when we can witness suffering without immediately jumping into action, when we can offer presence without attachment to outcome. This requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. We learn to be both caring and boundaried, both open and discerning, both willing to help and willing to let go. The wounded healer who has learned to tend their own inner landscape becomes a different kind of healer altogether. They no longer seek to heal others as a way of avoiding their own healing. Instead, they offer their own journey toward wholeness as a living example of what is possible. They understand that the most profound healing occurs not through intervention, but through witnessing, not through advice, but through presence, not through fixing, but through accepting. This transformation requires grieving the fantasy of being someone's savior, of being the one person who can love them enough to heal their wounds, of being special or necessary in ways that transcend the ordinary human experience of limitation and mortality. It means accepting that we are all wounded healers, all carrying both the capacity for profound healing and the need for profound healing, all stumbling toward wholeness through the darkness of our own unknowing. The synchronicity that once brought us broken people to fix begins to bring us whole people to journey with, conscious people to grow alongside, awakened people to learn from. The same mysterious force that orchestrated our unconscious patterns now serves our conscious evolution, creating encounters that support our authentic development rather than reenacting our ancient wounds. In this sacred space of self-reflection, we learn to recognize the difference between being drawn to someone because they need us and being drawn to someone because they see us. We learn to distinguish between the intensity of trauma bonding and the depth of authentic intimacy. We learn to honor our wounds, not as badges of our specialness or our capacity to help others, but as doorways into our own humanity, our own need for healing, our own journey toward wholeness. The wounded healer's dilemma is ultimately resolved, not through finding the perfect person to heal or to be healed by, but through learning to be in conscious relationship with our own wounds. When we can hold our pain with tenderness rather than urgency, when we can acknowledge our needs without making others responsible for meeting them, when we can offer our gifts without attachment to being needed, we step into the true power of the healer archetype. This is the great turning, the moment when the wound transforms from a source of unconscious compulsion into a source of conscious compassion. We still feel drawn to those who suffer, but now it is from a place of genuine service rather than unconscious need. We still offer our understanding to those in pain, but now it comes from a well of self-knowledge rather than a pool of projection. We still participate in the mysterious dance of healing relationship, but now we dance with awareness of our own steps, conscious of our own rhythm, awake to our own part in the ancient choreography of human connection and growth. In the mysterious alchemy of human connection, there exists a rare and precious transformation that occurs when two souls meet in the sacred space of authentic friendship. This is not the common companionship born of convenience or circumstance, nor the fragile alliance built upon mutual need or shared wounds. This is the profound encounter that Jung recognized as essential to the individuation process, the meeting of two beings who dare to support each other's journey toward wholeness, even when that journey leads them through territories that challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The individuation process, that lifelong journey toward psychological completeness, cannot be walked alone. Despite our culture's mythology of the solitary hero's journey, the path to wholeness requires witnesses, mirrors, and companions who can see us not only as we are, but as we have the potential to become. The authentic friend serves as a sacred vessel within which our deepest self can emerge, unfold, and be recognized, not despite our shadows and contradictions, but because of the fullness of our complex humanity. Most of what we call friendship operates at the level of persona, those carefully crafted masks we wear to navigate the social world. We gather with others who appreciate our wit, our interests, our opinions, our shared experiences. We form bonds based on compatibility, similarity, and the comfort of being understood within the narrow confines of who we think we are. These relationships, while pleasant and necessary, barely scratch the surface of what becomes possible when two people agree to be present to each other's becoming. The false friend, whether conscious or unconscious of their role, requires your diminishment. For their own sense of stability, they may encourage your dreams while secretly hoping you won't achieve them. They may offer support while subtly undermining your confidence. They may claim to love you while consistently relating to a limited version of who you are, resistant to the expansion and evolution that authentic growth demands. The false friend relates to you as a fixed entity, a known quantity, and any movement beyond their conception of who you are feels threatening to the relationship they have constructed. In the false friendship, there exists an unspoken contract that neither party will grow beyond the boundaries that made the relationship comfortable in the first place. Change is viewed as betrayal. Evolution is experienced as abandonment. The development of new interests, insights, or ways of being in the world is met with subtle or overt resistance, as if personal growth were somehow a criticism of what came before, or a rejection of the shared history that brought you together. But the authentic friend operates from an entirely different understanding of what relationship can be. They recognize that love is not a cage designed to keep someone safely contained within familiar boundaries, but rather a launching pad that supports the soul's journey toward its own truth. The authentic friend celebrates your becoming because they understand that your wholeness does not diminish them. It invites them into their own possibility for wholeness. This is the profound paradox that Jung understood so deeply. We become most fully ourselves, not in isolation, but in relationship, with others who can witness and celebrate our unfolding. The individuated self is not a separate self, but a self that has learned to relate authentically from a place of inner knowledge and acceptance. The person who has done the work of integrating their shadow, owning their projections, and accepting their full humanity becomes capable of relationships that serve the growth of all involved. In the sacred vessel of true friendship, both souls take turns being teacher and student, healer and patient, mirror and witness. There is a fluidity to these roles that reflects the natural rhythm of growth and development. Sometimes you are the one offering wisdom born of your own hard-won experience. Sometimes you are the one receiving guidance from someone who has walked a path you are just beginning to explore. Sometimes you are the strong one, capable of holding space for another's pain. Sometimes you are the vulnerable one, needing to be held while you navigate your own darkness. The authentic friend does not relate to you as a project to be fixed or a problem to be solved. They do not offer friendship contingent upon your achievement of some idealized version of yourself. Instead, they extend the radical acceptance that allows you to be exactly where you are in your journey, while simultaneously holding space for where you might be heading. This is not passive acceptance that enables stagnation, but rather the kind of loving witness that creates the safety necessary for genuine transformation. In the alchemical tradition that so fascinated Jung, the opus, the great work of transformation, required the presence of both solve and coagula, dissolution and coagulation, the breaking down of old forms and the conscious creation of new ones. The authentic friendship provides the container within which this psychological alchemy can occur safely. The false self, constructed from the expectations and demands of family, culture, and circumstance, must die for the true self to be born. This death is not a comfortable process, and it requires witnesses who can hold steady while you navigate the confusion and disorientation that accompanies any profound change. The authentic friend serves as a mirror, but not the kind of mirror that simply reflects back what you want to see or what makes you comfortable. They reflect your fullness, your light and your shadow, your gifts and your challenges, your conscious intentions and your unconscious patterns. They see through the personas you wear and relate to the deeper truth of who you are, even when you yourself have lost touch with that truth. This mirroring is not criticism disguised as friendship, nor is it the brutal honesty that wounds under the guise of helping. It is the gentle but unwavering reflection that comes from someone who has learned to see you clearly because they have learned to see themselves clearly. They can witness your self-deception without judgment because they have compassion for their own. They can point out your patterns without righteousness because they understand that we all have patterns, we all have blind spots, we all have work to do. The individuation process requires that we confront what Jung called the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, denied, or simply failed to see. The authentic friend does not shame you for having a shadow. They help you recognize that everyone has one. and that psychological wholeness comes not from eliminating our difficult aspects, but from integrating them consciously. They create the safety necessary for you to acknowledge your jealousy, your selfishness, your petty resentments, your secret fears, not so that you can wallow in these qualities, but so that you can transform your relationship to them. In the presence of an authentic friend, you discover that you can be angry without being destructive, sad without being self-pitying, afraid without being paralyzed, selfish without being cruel. You learn that emotions are information rather than commands, that patterns can be observed without being enacted, that you have choice in how you respond to the various energies that move through your psyche. This learning happens not through lectures or advice, but through the lived experience of being accepted in your fullness while being lovingly invited into greater consciousness. The teacher-student dynamic that emerges in authentic friendship is fluid and mutual. Sometimes you are the one who has walked through a particular kind of darkness and can offer guidance to someone just entering that territory. Sometimes you are the student, learning from someone whose journey has taken them to places you have never been. There is no hierarchy in this exchange, no sense that one person consistently knows more than the other. Instead, there is the recognition that we all carry different pieces of the puzzle of human experience, and that wisdom emerges through the generous sharing of what we have learned. The healer-patient dynamic operates similarly. Sometimes you are strong enough to hold space for another's pain, to witness their suffering without trying to fix it, to offer presence without advice. Sometimes you are the one who needs to be held, who needs to feel that your pain matters. To someone who needs the reminder that you are not alone in your struggle. The authentic friend can move between these roles naturally, without keeping score, without resentment, without the sense that they are giving more than they are receiving. This is possible because the authentic friend has learned to love without attachment to outcome. They support your growth, not because they need you to become someone different, but because they love who you are becoming. They celebrate your victories, not because it reflects well on them, but because your joy brings them joy. They sit with you in your defeats, not because they feel obligated, but because your healing serves the healing of the whole. The sacred vessel of true friendship creates a space outside of ordinary social contracts and expectations. Within this space, you can explore ideas that might seem crazy to others, express feelings that might seem inappropriate elsewhere, try on new ways of being that might seem inconsistent with who you have been. The authentic friend provides the laboratory within which you can experiment with becoming more fully yourself. This kind of friendship requires great courage from both parties. It demands that you be willing to be seen in your imperfection, to be loved in your confusion, to be supported in your evolution, even when that evolution leads you away from who you used to be. It requires that you extend the same grace to your friend, celebrating their growth even when it challenges your own comfort zones, supporting their truth even when it differs from your own. The transformation that occurs within authentic friendship is mutual and ongoing. As you witness your friend's courage to face their shadows, you find courage to face your own. As you watch them integrate difficult aspects of their personality, you discover new possibilities for your own integration. As you see them make choices from a place of inner knowing, rather than external expectation, you are inspired to trust your own inner wisdom. In the end, the individuation process and authentic friendship are not separate phenomena, but rather aspects of the same movement toward wholeness. We become most fully ourselves, not by withdrawing from relationship, but by learning to relate from a place of genuine self-knowledge and acceptance. The authentic friend is both catalyst and witness to this becoming, both mirror and companion, on the journey toward the fullness of who we have always had the potential to be. In this sacred space of mutual becoming, we discover that friendship is not about finding someone who likes the same things we like or shares our opinions about the world. It is about finding someone who can see our soul and celebrate its unfolding, who can witness our struggles and trust in our capacity for growth, who can love us not despite our complexity, but because of it. This is the friendship that serves the individuation process, the relationship that calls forth our authentic being, the connection that transforms both giver and receiver into the fullness of who they were always meant to become. We live in an age of unprecedented connection and profound isolation, where the ancient human need for authentic relationship has become entangled with the modern machinery of validation and performance. The digital revolution that promised to bring us closer together has instead created a vast theater of projection, where friendship itself has been transformed into a commodity to be accumulated, displayed, and consumed. In this strange new landscape of curated intimacy and manufactured closeness, we find ourselves face to face with what Jung would recognize as a collective shadow, the dark underside of our communal psyche, where our deepest needs for belonging have been hijacked by the ego's insatiable hunger for external confirmation. The collective shadow is not merely the sum of individual shadows, but rather a field of unconscious energy that emerges when groups of people collectively deny or repress certain aspects of human nature. In our contemporary moment, we have created a collective shadow around friendship itself, a shared blindness to what authentic relationship actually requires and what it can actually provide. We have substituted the appearance of connection for the reality of connection, the performance of intimacy for the vulnerability of intimacy, the accumulation of contacts for the cultivation of genuine understanding. This shadow manifests most clearly in the digital realm, where friendship has been reduced to metrics that can be counted, displayed, and compared. The number of friends, followers, likes, and comments becomes a kind of social currency that supposedly reflects our worth and desirability. But this quantification of relationship reveals a profound misunderstanding of what friendship actually is. You cannot measure the depth of a soul connection by the frequency of its public display. You cannot assess the quality of intimacy by the number of people who witness it. You cannot determine the value of a relationship by how well it translates into the language of social media engagement. Yet we find ourselves caught in this web of digital performance, often without fully recognizing how it has shaped our expectations and behaviors around friendship. We begin to relate to our relationships as content to be created and shared. We start to evaluate our connections based on their photogenic potential, their ability to generate engagement, their capacity to enhance our personal brand. The sacred becomes commodified, the private becomes public, and the authentic becomes subordinated to the performative. The archetypal need for community, that deep, primal hunger to belong to something larger than ourselves, becomes corrupted when it gets entangled with the ego's need for validation. The ego, in its limited understanding, mistakes quantity for quality, visibility for substance, reaction for connection. It believes that being seen by many is equivalent to being known by someone, that having numerous shallow connections is preferable to having few deep ones, that the approval of strangers carries the same weight as the understanding of intimates. This corruption of the community archetype creates a peculiar form of modern suffering. We find ourselves simultaneously overconnected and undernourished, constantly in touch, yet rarely truly met, surrounded by acquaintances, yet starving for authentic witnessing. The paradox of our time is that we have more ways to connect than ever before, yet many people report feeling more lonely than previous generations. This is not accidental, but rather the inevitable result of mistaking the shadow of relationship for relationship itself. The collective shadow around friendship manifests in our tendency to prioritize breadth over depth, to mistake familiarity for intimacy, to confuse entertainment with engagement. We scroll through endless feeds of other people's curated lives, consuming their moments of joy, success, and connection, as if we were participating in them rather than merely observing them. We begin to relate to friendship as a form of consumption, rather than creation, as something we take in, rather than something we actively build through presence, attention, and mutual vulnerability. In this digital landscape, the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear in social situations, has become hyperactive and hypervisible. We craft our online presence with the same care that previous generations might have devoted to their physical appearance, selecting which moments to share, which emotions to display, which aspects of our lives to highlight or hide. The persona, which was once primarily active in face-to-face social encounters, now operates 24 hours a day, constantly managing our digital representation and calculating its impact on our social standing. This perpetual persona management creates a split between our authentic inner experience and our public presentation that can become so normalized we stop noticing it. We become performers of our own lives, directors of our own reality show, constantly aware of how our actual experiences might translate into shareable content. The spontaneous moment gets interrupted by the impulse to document it. The private feeling gets evaluated for its public potential. The genuine interaction gets filtered through the question of how it might appear to others. The shadow of this dynamic is the profound exhaustion that comes from constantly curating our own existence, the loneliness that emerges from always being seen but rarely being known, the hunger for authentic connection that grows stronger even as our social networks expand. We find ourselves craving the very thing we are unconsciously avoiding, the messy, unpredictable, uncontrollable intimacy of genuine human relationship. Jung understood that the collective unconscious contains not only the positive archetypal patterns that guide human development, but also the potential for these patterns to become distorted when they are not consciously integrated. The community archetype, when it operates unconsciously, can become possessive, exclusive, and ultimately destructive. It can create in-groups and out-groups, us versus them dynamics, and the kind of tribal mentality that sees difference as threat, rather than diversity as richness. In our digital age, this shadow manifests as the tendency to create echo chambers, where we only interact with people who confirm our existing beliefs and perspectives. The algorithms that govern our social media feeds are designed to show us more of what we already engage with, creating a feedback loop that narrows rather than expands our understanding of the world. We begin to mistake our filtered bubble for reality itself, our curated community, for the full spectrum of human experience. This algorithmic amplification of similarity creates a false sense of connection that actually impedes genuine relationship. When we are only exposed to people who think like us, look like us, and share our values, we lose the opportunity to be challenged, expanded, and transformed by encounter with genuine otherness. We become comfortable in our assumptions, rigid in our perspectives, and ultimately isolated in our certainty. The therapeutic task in addressing this collective shadow is not to reject digital connection entirely, but rather to develop the consciousness necessary to use these tools in service of authentic relationship rather than as substitutes for it. This requires a kind of digital individuation, learning to navigate the online world while maintaining connection to our deeper values and authentic needs for human connection. The first step in this process involves recognizing when we are operating from the shadow, when we are performing rather than being authentic, when we are consuming rather than connecting, when we are collecting rather than cultivating relationships. This recognition requires developing what Jung called the observing ego, the capacity to step back and witness our own patterns without immediately judging or trying to change them. We must learn to recognize the feeling of being in authentic relationship versus the feeling of being in performative relationship. Authentic relationship feels nourishing even when it is challenging, grounding even when it is expansive, safe even when it is vulnerable. Performative relationship, by contrast, feels depleting even when it is praised, anxious even when it is successful, hollow even when it is entertaining. The cultivation of authentic friendship in the digital age requires intentional practices that counteract the gravitational pull toward performance and accumulation. This might involve choosing to have important conversations in person or on the phone, rather than through text. It might mean setting boundaries around how much of our private life we share publicly. It might involve regularly taking breaks from social media to reconnect with our own inner experience and the people in our immediate physical environment. Most importantly, it requires a commitment to depth over breadth, quality over quantity, presence over performance. This is countercultural in an age that celebrates networking, building your platform, and expanding your reach. It requires the courage to swim against the current of collective values and to choose the slower, more labor-intensive path of genuine relationship building. The sacred vessel of genuine connection cannot be digitized, commodified, or scaled. It emerges in the space between two people who are willing to be present to each other's reality without immediately trying to fix, change, or perform for each other. It requires time, attention, and the kind of sustained presence that cannot be reduced to metrics or measured by engagement rates. In navigating this landscape while maintaining our commitment to authentic relationship, we must become like skilled alchemists, able to extract the gold from the dross to find the genuine amid the artificial, to maintain our connection to what is real while operating in a world increasingly dominated by simulation and representation. This is not about rejecting modernity or retreating into some romanticized vision of the past, but rather about bringing consciousness to our relationship with the tools and systems that shape our social reality. It is about learning to use technology rather than being used by it, to engage with digital platforms rather than being consumed by them, to maintain our humanity in the face of forces that would reduce us to data points and engagement metrics. The collective shadow of modern friendship is not insurmountable, but it requires conscious effort to address. It asks us to become more discerning about what we call friendship, more intentional about how we invest our relational energy, more committed to the practices that cultivate genuine intimacy and understanding. It invites us to become guardians of the sacred vessel of authentic connection, protectors of the space where souls can meet and be transformed by the encounter. In the end, the antidote to the collective shadow is not more technology or better algorithms, but rather the ancient practices of presence, attention, and genuine care for another's well-being. It is the willingness to be inconvenienced by relationship, to be changed by encounter, to be uncomfortable in the service of truth. It is the recognition that the most profound connections happen not in the spaces designed for connection, but in the moments when we choose to be fully present to another human being, regardless of who might be watching or what we might gain from the exchange. In the sacred laboratory of relationship, where souls meet and transformation occurs, there exists an art as ancient as alchemy itself, the delicate craft of creating boundaries that serve both protection and connection. Like the alchemist's crucible, which must be strong enough to contain the fierce heat of transformation, yet permeable enough to allow the essential vapors to escape, healthy boundaries form the sacred container within which authentic relationship can unfold without losing its essence to the contaminating influences of unconscious patterns and toxic dynamics. Jung understood that the individuated person must learn to navigate the paradox of separateness and connection, of maintaining their essential self while remaining open to genuine relationship. This requires what we might call the alchemy of boundary setting, the mystical art of creating membranes rather than walls, filters rather than barriers, containers rather than cages. The boundary that serves authentic relationship is not a fortress designed to keep others out, but rather a sacred space that allows healthy exchange while preventing the kind of psychic contamination that destroys both self and other. Most of us were never taught this alchemical art. Instead, we learn to relate from the extremes of either fusion or isolation, either losing ourselves completely in the other or defending ourselves so thoroughly that no genuine connection becomes possible. We learn to build walls when we needed membranes, to create barriers when we needed filters, to construct fortresses when we needed gardens with carefully tended gates. The fusion extreme manifests as the unconscious dissolution of self in relationship. Here, boundaries become so permeable that there is no longer any distinction between self and other, between your feelings and their feelings, between your needs and their needs, between your responsibility and their responsibility. This is not love, though it often masquerades as such. It is rather the abdication of the difficult work of remaining a conscious individual while in relationship with another conscious individual. In fusion, we lose access to our own inner wisdom because we become so focused on reading the other person's energy, anticipating their needs, managing their emotions, and maintaining their comfort that we forget to check in with our own truth. We become like chameleons, constantly adapting our color to match our environment until we no longer remember what our original hue might have been. This unconscious merging creates a kind of relational codependency where neither person can access their authentic self because both are too busy trying to be what they think the other needs them to be. The isolation extreme manifests as boundaries so rigid that no genuine exchange becomes possible. Here, the fear of losing oneself in relationship creates such defensive structures that intimacy, vulnerability, and authentic connection are sacrificed in the name of self-protection. The person who operates from this extreme may appear strong and independent, but they are actually imprisoned within their own defenses, cut off from the nourishing flow of genuine human connection. These rigid boundaries often develop as a protective response to early experiences of boundary violation, betrayal, or abandonment. The psyche, in its wisdom, creates walls to prevent further harm, but these same walls that protect also isolate. The person becomes like a castle surrounded by a moat, safe from invasion, but also cut off from visitors, protected from harm, but also deprived of the sustenance that comes from genuine relationship. The alchemical art of boundary setting requires learning to navigate between these extremes, to create what Jung might call a transcendent function, a third way that honors both the need for connection and the need for individual integrity. This transcendent function operates through boundaries that are both strong and flexible, both protective and permeable, both discriminating and welcoming. Like the cell membrane that allows nutrients to pass through while keeping toxins out, healthy boundaries serve a filtering function. They do not block all exchange, but rather discriminate between what serves growth and what serves destruction, between what nourishes and what depletes, between what supports authentic relationship and what perpetuates unconscious patterns. This discrimination is not judgment in the moralistic sense, but rather discernment in the spiritual sense, the capacity to recognize what serves life and what serves death. The alchemical process of learning to set healthy boundaries begins with the recognition that boundaries are not selfish, but rather essential to the health of any relationship. Without boundaries, there is no container within which transformation can occur. Without boundaries, there is no protection for the vulnerable processes of growth and healing. Without boundaries, there is no way to distinguish between genuine intimacy and unconscious enmeshment, between authentic care and toxic rescuing, between healthy support and codependent enabling. This recognition often comes as a revelation to those who have been taught that love means having no limits, that caring means saying yes to everything, that goodness means putting others' needs before your own in all circumstances. But the alchemists knew that without the proper container, even the most precious materials will be lost or contaminated. The sacred work of transformation requires a vessel that can hold the intensity of the process without being destroyed by it. Learning to set boundaries is learning to honor both your own needs and the needs of others without sacrificing either on the altar of false harmony. False harmony is the peace that comes from avoiding conflict at all costs, from suppressing truth to maintain comfort, from sacrificing authenticity to preserve the appearance of agreement. This kind of harmony is not sustainable because it is built on the foundation of unconsciousness rather than genuine understanding. True harmony, by contrast, emerges from the creative tension between different needs, perspectives, and truths. It is the harmony that comes from each person in the relationship taking responsibility for their own experience while remaining genuinely interested in and responsive to the other's experience. This requires boundaries that are clear enough to prevent confusion and flexible enough to allow for growth and change. The practice of healthy boundary setting begins with the development of what Jung called the observing ego. The capacity to step back and witness your own patterns, reactions, and responses without immediately acting on them. This observing function allows you to notice when you are beginning to lose yourself in fusion or beginning to withdraw into isolation. It creates a space of consciousness between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction, between impulse and action. From this space of conscious awareness, you can begin to experiment with different ways of responding to the various pressures and demands that arise in relationship. You can learn to say no without being cruel, to say yes without being resentful, to express your needs without being demanding, to listen to others' needs without feeling obligated to meet them all. You can begin to distinguish between what is yours to carry and what belongs to the other person, between what you can control and what you must accept. The alchemical transformation that occurs through healthy boundary setting is not just personal, but relational. When you learn to hold your own space while remaining open to genuine connection, you invite the other person to do the same. When you stop trying to manage their emotions, you free them to take responsibility for their own emotional life. When you stop sacrificing your truth to maintain their comfort, you create space for both truths to coexist and perhaps even to find creative synthesis. This transformation is not always smooth or comfortable. Like all alchemical processes, it involves periods of dissolution and confusion, moments when the old patterns are breaking down, but the new ones have not yet solidified. There may be conflict as the relationship adjusts to new ways of relating. There may be discomfort as each person learns to tolerate the space between self and other. There may be grief as the fantasy of perfect understanding or complete fusion is released. But through this difficult passage, something precious is born. The possibility of authentic relationship between two conscious individuals. This is not the seamless merging of souls that romantic mythology promises, but rather the much more challenging and ultimately more satisfying encounter between two people who have learned to be themselves while remaining genuinely curious about and responsive to each other. The membrane of healthy boundaries allows for what Jung called psychological breathing, the natural rhythm of connection and separation, intimacy and independence, togetherness and apartness that characterizes mature relationship. Just as physical breathing requires both inhalation and exhalation, psychological health requires both the capacity to open and connect and the capacity to close and restore. Without this rhythm, relationship becomes either suffocating or sterile. The person who has learned the alchemy of boundary setting becomes like a skilled gardener who knows when to water and when to allow the soil to dry, when to prune and when to let grow, when to protect and when to expose to the elements. They understand that healthy relationship requires both nourishment and space, both support and challenge, both acceptance and discernment. This skill is particularly crucial in our contemporary moment, when the pressure to be constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly accommodating has reached unprecedented levels. The digital age has blurred many of the natural boundaries that once protected our inner lives and private relationships. We are bombarded with requests, demands, and expectations from multiple directions simultaneously, making the art of boundary setting more essential than ever. Learning to create sacred space in the midst of this chaos requires the same kind of focused intention that the alchemists brought to their work. It requires the patience to tend the slow processes of transformation, the wisdom to discriminate between what serves life and what serves death, the courage to maintain your truth even when it creates discomfort for others. The boundaries that emerge from this alchemical process are not rigid rules imposed from the outside, but rather organic expressions of inner wisdom. They arise from a deep understanding of what you need to maintain your integrity, what you can genuinely offer without depletion, what serves your growth and what serves your relationships. They are boundaries that honor both the mystery of your own becoming and the mystery of the other's becoming. In the end, the alchemy of boundary setting is not about learning to keep others out, but about learning to keep yourself present to your own truth, present to your own needs, present to your own capacity for growth and connection. When you can remain present to yourself while in relationship with others, you create the conditions within which authentic transformation becomes possible for all involved. This is the sacred vessel that the alchemists knew was essential to their work. Not a container that imprisons, but one that protects. Not a barrier that isolates, but a membrane that filters. Not a wall that separates, but a sacred space that allows the profound work of conscious relationship to unfold in its own mysterious timing, according to its own secret wisdom. The hero's journey, that archetypal pattern that echoes through every mythology and lives within every human soul, does not end with the conquest of the dragon or the discovery of the treasure. The true culmination of the journey comes in the return, that sacred moment when the hero brings the hard-won wisdom back to the community, transforming not only themselves, but the world they left behind. Having descended into the underworld of false friendship, having faced the shadows of projection and codependency, having learned the alchemy of boundaries and the art of authentic connection, we now stand at the threshold of return, carrying within us the precious gift of discernment and the transformative power of conscious relationship. This return is not a simple reversion to what was before, but rather a spiraling ascent to a new level of being, one that incorporates all that has been learned in the darkness and all that has been sacrificed on the altar of growth. We come back to the world of relationship changed, bearing the treasure of inner knowledge and the capacity for genuine connection. But this return brings with it both opportunity and responsibility, both the possibility of creating authentic community and the challenge of remaining true to our deepest knowing while navigating a world that often rewards superficiality over depth. Jung's vision of the individuated person was never one of splendid isolation, of the awakened soul retreating from the messiness of human connection into the purity of solitary enlightenment. Rather, he understood that true individuation leads not away from relationship, but toward more conscious participation in the collective, more skillful engagement with the web of human connection, more authentic contribution to the communities that shape and sustain human life. The individuated person does not transcend the need for relationship, but rather learns to engage in relationship from a place of inner wholeness rather than inner emptiness. This conscious participation in community requires a fundamental shift in how we approach the entire enterprise of friendship and connection. Instead of entering relationships primarily to get our needs met, to heal our wounds, or to complete what feels missing within us, we begin to approach relationship as an opportunity to give from our fullness, to share from our abundance, to contribute to the growth and well-being of others from a place of genuine care rather than unconscious need. This shift does not mean that we no longer have needs, or that authentic relationship doesn't involve mutual support and nourishment. Rather, it means that we have learned to distinguish between conscious needs that can be clearly communicated and unconsciously met within healthy relationship, and unconscious needs that drive us to use others as objects for our own healing or completion. The person who has done their inner work can ask for support without demanding rescue, can offer help without needing to be needed, can receive love without losing themselves in gratitude. Building authentic community begins with the recognition that we attract what we are, not what we want. If we seek authentic relationships while remaining inauthentic ourselves, we will find ourselves in the familiar territory of performance and pretense. If we desire deep connections while maintaining shallow engagement with our own inner life, we will continue to be disappointed by the superficiality of our relationships. The path to meaningful community starts with the commitment to becoming a person worthy of the sacred gift of genuine connection. This worthiness is not earned through perfection or achieved through the elimination of all shadow and struggle. Rather, it emerges from the willingness to be honest about our imperfections, conscious of our patterns, and responsible for our impact on others. It comes from developing what Jung called ethical commitment, not the rigid adherence to external moral codes, but the living expression of our deepest values in our daily interactions with others. The person who has learned to build authentic community has developed the capacity to see others clearly, not through the lens of their own projections, not through the filter of their own needs, not through the distortion of their own wounds, but with the kind of clear seeing that recognizes the full humanity of the other person. This clear seeing allows them to respond to who the person actually is, rather than who they wish they were, who they fear they might be, or who they need them to be. This clarity of perception extends to recognizing the difference between people who are ready for authentic relationship and those who are still operating primarily from unconscious patterns. Not everyone is at the same place in their journey toward consciousness, and part of building authentic community involves learning to meet people where they are while maintaining appropriate boundaries around what level of intimacy and vulnerability is wise to share. The discernment that comes from having journeyed through the underworld of false friendship allows us to recognize the signs of authentic readiness for deep relationship. These signs are not about perfection or the absence of challenges, but rather about consciousness, responsibility, and genuine interest in growth. The person ready for authentic friendship can acknowledge their mistakes without being devastated by them, can receive feedback without becoming defensive, can hold space for conflict without needing to immediately resolve it. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, the capacity to be curious about their own inner life and respectful of the inner life of others. They have developed the ability to distinguish between thoughts and feelings, between reactions and responses, between their story and their experience. They can take responsibility for their impact without taking responsibility for others' reactions, can be influenced by feedback without being controlled by approval or disapproval. The authentic community that emerges from these conscious relationships is not a utopian fantasy where conflict never occurs and misunderstandings never arise. Rather, it is a network of people who have learned to navigate difficulty with grace, to communicate truthfully with kindness, to maintain their own center while remaining genuinely curious about others' experiences. It is a community where growth is supported, where mistakes are opportunities for learning, where differences are seen as invitations to expand rather than threats to be defended against. In such a community, friendship becomes a spiritual practice, a way of engaging with the sacred dimension of human connection. Each interaction becomes an opportunity for both parties to practice presence, to offer authentic witness, to support each other's journey toward wholeness. The conversations that emerge in this context go beyond the surface pleasantries of social convention and the dramatic intensities of unconscious entanglement, finding their way to the middle ground of genuine inquiry and mutual exploration. The building of authentic community requires patience, as real relationships cannot be rushed or manufactured, but must be allowed to develop according to their own organic timing. It requires discernment, as not every connection is meant to become a deep friendship, and not every person who expresses interest in our lives is prepared for the level of authenticity that genuine relationship requires. It requires commitment, as the maintenance of conscious relationship takes ongoing attention and care. Most importantly, it requires the willingness to be transformed by our connections with others. Authentic community is not a collection of fixed individuals who happen to enjoy each other's company, but rather a living system where each person's growth contributes to the growth of the whole, where each person's healing supports the healing of all, where each person's awakening serves the awakening of the collective. This willingness to be changed by relationship means approaching friendship not as a place to find validation for who we already are, but as a laboratory for discovering who we might become. It means being open to having our perspectives challenged, our assumptions questioned, our blind spots illuminated. It means welcoming the discomfort that comes when someone we care about sees us more clearly than we see ourselves, or when their growth requires us to examine our own stagnation. The mutual growth that characterizes authentic community happens, not through direct intervention or advice giving, but through the more subtle influences of modeling, witnessing, and creating space for each other's unfolding. When we are around people who are committed to their own growth, who take responsibility for their own experience, who approach life with curiosity and courage, we are naturally invited to embody these qualities ourselves. The honest communication that sustains authentic community is not the brutal honesty that wounds under the guise of helping, nor the diplomatic politeness that avoids all potentially difficult topics. Rather, it is the kind of truthfulness that emerges from genuine care for the relationship and respect for both parties' capacity to handle reality. It involves speaking our truth without making others wrong for their truth, sharing our experience without requiring others to validate it, asking for what we need without demanding that others provide it. This level of communication requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function in relationship, the capacity to hold the tension between different needs, perspectives, and truths, without immediately moving to resolve the tension through compromise or domination. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is to allow disagreement to exist without rushing to agreement, to let different truths coexist without requiring synthesis, to respect the mystery of the other person's experience, even when it differs dramatically from our own. The respect for each other's journey toward wholeness that characterizes authentic community means recognizing that everyone's path of development is unique, that what serves one person's growth may not serve another's, that timing and readiness cannot be forced or manipulated. It means being willing to let people make their own mistakes, learn their own lessons, and find their own way, even when we can see clearly where they might be heading toward difficulty. This respect extends to honoring the different seasons of People's lives and relationships. Sometimes a friend needs our active support and involvement. Sometimes they need space to integrate their experiences without outside input. Sometimes they need challenge and confrontation. Sometimes they need acceptance and validation. The skilled friend learns to read these seasons and respond appropriately, offering what is needed rather than what they prefer to give. As we build authentic community, we discover that the treasure we brought back from our journey through the underworld continues to multiply and transform. The discernment we developed in learning to recognize false friendship becomes wisdom we can share with others who are beginning their own journey. The boundaries we learned to set become models for others who are struggling with fusion or isolation. The authenticity we fought to reclaim becomes an invitation for others to drop their masks and reveal their true faces. The sacred return is never complete, for consciousness is not a destination, but a way of traveling. The community we build becomes both the fruit of our growth and the context for continued growth. Each authentic relationship we cultivate becomes a teacher, a mirror, an opportunity for deeper understanding of ourselves and others. Each genuine connection we make contributes to the healing of the collective unconscious, adding to the reservoir of conscious relationship from which future generations can draw. In this final recognition, we understand that authentic friendship is indeed not just about finding the right people, but about becoming the right person. Not perfect, not without shadow or struggle, but conscious, responsible, and genuinely committed to the sacred work of human connection. In becoming such a person, we participate in the ancient alchemical tradition of transforming base metal into gold, of turning the raw material of human relationship into the precious substance of authentic community. This is the gift we offer to the world upon our return, not just our own healing, but our capacity to create spaces where healing becomes possible for others. Not just our own authenticity, but our ability to invite and support authenticity in those around us. Not just our own journey toward wholeness, but our contribution to the collective journey toward a more conscious, connected, and compassionate way of being human together. And so we arrive at the final movement of our psychological symphony, where the deepest truth reveals itself not as a destination, but as an eternal dance. Listen, dear soul, to the wisdom that emerges from the depths of human experience. Shadow and light will forever waltz together in the sacred realm of relationship, and this is not our failing, but our most profound gift. In the quietude of morning, when the world holds its breath between night and day, we witness this dance in its purest form. The shadows cast by trees are not enemies of the light, but partners in a cosmic choreography, each defining the other, each giving meaning to the other's existence. So too in the landscape of human connection, where even the most authentic friendships carry within them the seeds of projection, the tender buds of misunderstanding, and the endless possibility of growth. Jung, that wise cartographer of the psyche, understood what our modern world has forgotten. Perfection is not the goal of relationship, but consciousness is. We have been taught to seek flawless connections, to demand that our friends mirror back to us only what we wish to see, to expect that love should flow without friction or challenge. But the master of the unconscious knew better. He saw that, in the very tensions and contradictions of relationship, lies the alchemical fire that transforms us from mere personalities into authentic beings. Consider the oak tree in winter, its branches bare against the grey sky. Does it apologize for its nakedness? Does it hide from the world its gnarled imperfections, its asymmetries, its scars from countless storms? No, it stands in full truth, and in that truth it becomes magnificent. The tree teaches us that relationships too must have their seasons of bareness, their moments when the leaves of pretense fall away and we stand revealed in all our human complexity. You have felt this, haven't you? That moment when a friend sees not your carefully crafted persona, but the raw truth beneath, your fears, your jealousies, your ancient wounds. The ego recoils, whispers of shame and withdrawal, but something deeper knows. This is not betrayal, but benediction, for only when we are seen in our totality can we be loved in our totality. The shadow, that repository of all we have rejected about ourselves, does not disappear when we enter relationship. Indeed, it often becomes more active, more insistent, like a child demanding attention. We see in our friends the very qualities we have banished from our own self-image. The friend who speaks too boldly triggers our disowned assertiveness. The one who weeps openly confronts our buried grief. The one who pursues success relentlessly mirrors our own hidden ambitions. This is projection in its rawest form, not malice, but unconsciousness. We take the contents of our inner world and paint them across the canvas of another's being. Yet Jung teaches us that even this seeming confusion serves the self. For in projecting onto others, we eventually must reclaim what we have projected. The qualities that disturb us most in our friends are often the very aspects of ourselves seeking integration. But here lies the sacred paradox. We must neither demonize projection nor excuse it. To say, this is just my projection, and dismiss the impact of our unconscious reactions is spiritual bypassing of the highest order. To blame others entirely for triggering our wounds is to remain trapped in the prison of unconsciousness. The middle way, Jung's via regia, requires us to hold both truths simultaneously. This is my material to work with, and this relationship is real and deserving of care. In the crucible of authentic friendship, we learn to dance with these contradictions. We feel the heat of triggered emotion, and neither act it out unconsciously nor suppress it entirely. Instead, we create what Jung called the transcendent function, a third way that emerges when we hold the tension between opposites without collapse or dissolution. Picture two dancers who have been partners for decades. They know each other's rhythms, have learned to anticipate the moments when one might stumble, have developed an exquisite sensitivity to the other's energy. Yet they are not merged. Each maintains their unique style, their individual expression within the shared choreography. When one falters, the other adjusts without losing their own center. When conflicts arise about direction or tempo, they find ways to honor both voices while serving the dance itself. This is the matured friendship. Not the absence of friction, but the presence of consciousness around that friction. We learn to recognize the early warning signs of projection, the sudden heat of judgment, the feeling that our friend has suddenly changed, the conviction that they are entirely wrong about something. In these moments, we pause, we breathe, we ask not, how can I fix them, but what in me is being activated? Yet this inner work must never become narcissistic self-absorption. True consciousness in relationship means caring for both the inner process and the outer connection. When we project, we take responsibility for our inner material while also acknowledging the impact on our friend. When others project onto us, we neither absorb their unconscious content nor reject them entirely, but find ways to remain present to both their process and our own truth. The dance becomes more intricate. As we mature, we learn to recognize not just our own projections, but the dance of mutual projection that occurs in any deep relationship. You see in me what you have disowned. I see in you what I have rejected. Together, we become mirrors in a hall of consciousness, each reflection revealing new aspects of the wholeness we are each seeking to embody. Sometimes the dance is gentle, like morning mist rising from a lake. Other times it is fierce, like storm winds that strip away everything that is not essential. Both movements serve the process of individuation, that lifelong journey toward becoming who we truly are beneath all the layers of conditioning and defense. In these stormy seasons of relationship, when projections fly like debris in a hurricane, we must remember that destruction often precedes creation. The false self that we have presented to our friends must sometimes be dismantled before the authentic self can emerge. This dismantling is rarely graceful. We may say things we later regret, reveal aspects of ourselves that feel shameful, discover that we are not the people we thought we were. But Jung reminds us that this too is sacred. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction that must occur before transformation is possible. In relationship, our nigredo moments are when all our careful social masks fall away and we stand naked in our human messiness. It is terrifying and humbling, but it is also the birthplace of authentic intimacy. The friend who can witness our nigredo without fleeing, who can remain present to our process without trying to fix or change us, offers us one of the greatest gifts imaginable. They become what Jung called the container, strong enough to hold the intensity of our transformation without being destroyed by it. But let us be clear. This does not mean becoming martyrs to each other's unconsciousness. The container must have boundaries, must know when to say, "I cannot hold this," must protect its own integrity even while serving the relationship. The dance of shadow and light requires two whole dancers, not one strong partner carrying another who has collapsed. As we mature in this dance, we begin to recognize the archetypal patterns that play out in all relationships. The parent-child dynamic that emerges when one friend becomes the eternal teacher and the other the eternal student. The sibling rivalry that surfaces when both are competing for the same recognition. The lover-beloved pattern that creates inappropriate intimacy or devastating rejection. These archetypal patterns are not problems to be solved, but energies to be consciously engaged. When we recognize that the anger we feel toward our friend carries within it the ancient pattern of the rebellious child confronting the restrictive parent, we can choose how to work with that energy rather than being unconsciously driven by it. The shadow, too, has its archetypal manifestations in relationship. The scapegoat who carries the group's disowned negativity, the saboteur who unconsciously undermines what is being built, the victim who recruits others into endless sympathy, the rescuer who becomes addicted to being needed. None of these are inherently evil. They are natural psychological patterns seeking expression and ultimately integration. In conscious friendship, we learn to recognize these shadow patterns not as judgments, but as information. "Ah," we might say, "I see the saboteur is active today. What is it trying to protect? What legitimate need is it expressing in this destructive way?" This transforms the shadow from enemy to ally, from obstacle to teacher. The light, meanwhile, carries its own dangers in relationship. The friend who can only see the positive, who refuses to acknowledge difficulty or conflict, who insists on perpetual harmony, may seem easier to be with, but they deny us the full spectrum of relationship. Their light, however well-intentioned, can become a prison of false positivity that prevents real intimacy from developing. True light in relationship is not the absence of darkness, but the consciousness that can illuminate darkness without being consumed by it. It is the friend who can see our potential even when we are lost in our limitations, who can hold space for our becoming even when we are trapped in our patterns, who can love us not despite our shadows, but including them. This quality of light does not come from perfection, but from integration. The friend who has befriended their own shadow can be present to ours without judgment or fear. They have learned that darkness is not the opposite of love, but one of love's many faces, the love that says, I will not abandon you even in your most unlovable moments. And so the dance continues, season after season, year after year. We stumble and recover, project and reclaim, wound and heal. Each cycle deepens our capacity for relationship, not by making us perfect partners, but by making us conscious ones. The goal is never to eliminate the dance of shadow and light, but to dance it with increasing awareness, grace, and compassion. We learn to feel the music that underlies all relationship, the rhythm of connection and separation, intimacy and autonomy, challenge and support that is as natural as breathing. In time, we may discover that our closest friendships become laboratories of consciousness, spaces where we can experiment with new ways of being, where we can practice the art of seeing and being seen, where we can learn to love not just the persona, but the whole person, shadow and light intertwined. This is perhaps the greatest gift that conscious relationship offers. It becomes a mirror of the self, that archetype of wholeness that Jung saw as the goal of human development. In learning to accept the totality of another person, their beauty and their limitations, their wisdom and their folly, their light and their shadow, we practice accepting the totality of ourselves. The self, Jung tells us, is not the perfected ego, but the integration of all opposites, the divine pattern that includes and transcends every partial identity we have ever worn. In relationship, we catch glimpses of this self, both in ourselves and others. We see moments when someone moves beyond their usual patterns, when they embody a wholeness that is larger than their personality, when they become transparent to the sacred dimension of their being. These moments are rare and precious, like shooting stars in the night sky of ordinary consciousness. But they remind us of what is possible, of the direction in which the dance is moving. We are not dancing toward perfection, but toward integration, not toward the elimination of contradiction, but toward the capacity to hold contradiction with love. And in this capacity lies the secret of sustainable relationship, when we can love both the shadow and the light in ourselves and others, when we can hold space for the full spectrum of human experience without trying to fix or change what we encounter, we discover something remarkable. Relationships become not burdens to be endured, but laboratories of the sacred, spaces where the divine self can play out its endless creativity through the forms of human connection. The dance of shadow and light, we realize, is not something we must transcend, but something we are privileged to participate in. It is the very music of existence, the rhythm by which consciousness explores itself through relationship, the way the universe knows itself through the endless permutations of connection and separation, love and challenge, recognition and mystery. So, we dance on, not knowing where the music will lead us, trusting that each movement serves some larger choreography, that each partner we encounter teaches us something essential about the art of being human. In the end, we discover that the dance itself is the destination, that consciousness is not an achievement but a way of moving through the world, that love is not a feeling but a quality of presence we can bring to each moment of connection. The eternal dance of shadow and light continues, and we are both its dancers and its witnesses, its students and its teachers, forever learning the ancient art of holding opposites in the crucible of relationship, forever discovering new possibilities for what it means to be fully, authentically, courageously human in connection with one another. YouTube video description. In this soul-searching exploration, we descend into the shadowy terrain of human connection to uncover a truth Carl Jung understood intimately. Not all who call themselves friends come bearing gifts of light. Some arrive as unconscious emissaries of our own disowned psyche, mirrors of unmet needs, wounded archetypes, and shadow projections. This video offers a psychologically profound meditation on the 5 demands that betray the presence of the false friend, the energy vampire cloaked in the guise of intimacy. Drawing deeply from Jungian concepts like projection, the persona, enantiodromia, and the transcendent function, we reveal how these archetypal patterns silently govern our relationships, often without our awareness. But this is not merely an examination of others' behavior, it is a confrontation with ourselves. With poetic intensity and philosophical depth, we explore how false friendships are often co-authored by the unloved, unseen aspects of our own inner world. These connections challenge us to withdraw projections, own our shadow, and mature emotionally, to move from compulsive giving to conscious relating. Ultimately, this is a video not about betrayal, but about individuation, the sacred process of becoming whole through discernment, self-reclamation, and inner alignment. True friendship begins where self-abandonment ends. If this resonates, share your experience below. What have false friendships taught you about your own shadow and your journey toward authenticity? Hashtags: Psyche, Carl Jung, Psyche, Jungian psychology. Shadow work, individuation, false self, emotional vampires, persona and shadow, projection and integration, trickster archetype, transcendent function,